in the quiet layers beneath our feet. History hides more than forgotten cities, it hides forgotten worlds. For centuries, legends have whispered of civilizations swallowed not by time, but by Earth itself, buried in mood, sealed in silence, and erased from memory. Tonight, we follow those whispers into the depths, where ancient reset myths begun and where truth waits in the dark. The world below our feet. We begin with a simple observation, one so ordinary, so quietly woven into the texture of modern life that most people walk past it without a second thought. Across major American and European cities, from the damp brick tunnels of Seattle's forgotten underground to the oldest, uneven streets of Boston, the ground floor is often not the bottom floor. Beneath our shops, beneath our homes, beneath the pavement we trust with every step, another world waits. A world buried, a world dimmed, a world whose story is whispered through dust and stone. Some say this buried world is merely the result of changing city plans, rising street levels, fires, and floods. But others off on, the ones who spend their days hunched over old maps or their nights exploring forbidden tunnels, believe there is something far older, far stranger at work. For if you dig just a few feet in certain neighborhoods of Portland, or beneath the worn cobblestones of Edinburgh, or even below the quiet storefronts of Prague, you'll find not loose soil or broken foundation, but rooms with doors that open inward, rooms with windows facing what used to be open air, entire floors that were once street, now trapped in darkness. The first time Amelia Cross heard about it, she was 8 years old. Her grandfather, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers from decades of handling old manuscripts, told her stories of the world below our feet. Stories he delivered in a tone so gentle, so matter-of-fact, that they never felt like myths or bedtime tales. To Amelia, even then, they felt like warnings. Cities grow upward, he would say, tapping the top of her head with the spine of a leather-bound atlas, but sometimes they swallow what came before. Years later, Amelia would remember those words as she stood alone in a narrow alleyway in downtown Boston, staring at a half-exposed archway where the concrete had cracked away. The street was loud, cars hissing past, people arguing over a parking spot, someone shouting at a dog butt. The moment she saw that arch, all sound faded. There, beneath the asphalt, lay brickwork from another century, not above, not part of a basement. Something else, something that shouldn't be there. She crouched, brushing away bits of dust and grit with her bare fingers. The arch wasn't just old, it was worn, eroded in the way stones are smoothed only by time and moving water, the kind of erosion that no city engineer could explain. And tucked into the far corner of the archway, almost invisible unless someone looked closely, was the unmistakable outline of a carved symbol, a circle intersected by 3 lines. She'd seen it before in her grandfather's notes, scribbled in margins he never intended anyone to read. Her heart thudded. It wasn't possible. Those notes belonged to stories, to folklore, to the speculative ramblings of a man who spent too many nights tracing the histories of places most people didn't know existed. But the symbol was right there, carved into stone older than most of the buildings around her. Amelia took a shaky breath and stepped back. For years, she had avoided the mystery her grandfather had devoted his life to. She had chosen a different path: modern archaeology, museum documentation, safe work, predictable hours, but the world below her feet. It was calling, or perhaps it had been calling all along, and she was only now ready to hear it. As she stood there, watching the shadowed shape of the archway flicker under the passing headlights, she realized something unsettling. This wasn't an isolated discovery. Over the past months, she had received emails from researchers in Chicago, letters from archivists in London, and even a shaky phone call from an urban explorer in Seattle, all describing similar findings: hidden floors, buried doorways, sealed corridors stretching beneath cities where no official maps recorded any such passageways. And untouched for centuries. Amelia closed her eyes for a moment. The cold winter air scraped against her throat as she tried to think logically, to form a rational explanation. Maybe the structure was part of an old drainage system. Maybe the carved symbol was graffiti left by some long-forgotten mason. Maybe she was overreacting, but deep down, beyond reason, beyond training, beyond professional caution, she knew better. Something was buried underfoot. Something built long before the cities that now rested on top of it. Something that cities, intentionally or not, had grown over like scar tissue. Her fingers brushed the edge of the archway again. Beneath her touch, the stone felt almost warm, as though retaining a memory of sunlight it had not seen in centuries. She stood up slowly. If she wanted answers, she'd have to go downward, not metaphorically, but literally, into the layers of forgotten earth, into the places where history blurred into something older, something unrecorded, something people were not meant to find. Above her, the city pulsed with light and noise and life, oblivious to the world below. But Amelia Cross, for the first time since childhood, felt the quiet shift of fate, the sense that she was standing at the edge of a story too large to comprehend, a story that had waited generations for someone to continue it. And beneath her, boots far deeper than the archway itself, something ancient stirred, waiting, watching, remembering. The silent architectural anomalies. Amelia Cross had always believed that buildings carried memories, quiet ones, buried beneath plaster and paint, hidden in foundations most people never thought twice about. But as the weeks passed and she wandered through city after city with her notebook, she began to understand something far more unsettling. Architecture didn't just remember history. It recorded the parts people were never meant to forget. What she first noticed in Boston's older districts, she now saw everywhere: patterns, repeating like echoes across continents. At first, she thought they were simple structural quirks. A misplaced window here, a strangely low doorway there. But the more she looked, the more those details aligned into an undeniable, disturbing tapestry. Across neighborhoods where buildings had stood for centuries, she began observing basement windows clearly designed as street-level stores. Their frames were decorative, intended to display goods to people walking outside. Yet now, those same windows stared into nothing but compacted soil. No sunlight, no street, no life, just dirt. Some of these windows still held rusted bars, indicating they were once meant for security, not basement ventilation. Others were adorned with flaking gold paint or etched designs, hinting at their past roles. Bakeries, tailor shops, bookbinders, tea merchants, evidence of a city that once thrived at a lower depth. One afternoon in Portland, she paused in front of an old brick building whose entrance sat a full 3 feet below the modern sidewalk. A short set of steep concrete steps led down to the door, but the door itself was wrong. It had a decorative arch, carved with meticulous craftsmanship, 3 leaves curling into a single vine. It was designed to announce a business, a home. A life, not a cellar. Yet now, the doorway opened into a cramped, damp space used for storage. The original threshold buried behind generations of mud and earth. The owner told her the basement flooded often, even though no water source was nearby. It's like the ground itself remembers being lower, he joked. Amelia didn't laugh, because this was no isolated phenomena. She collected photographs from anonymous urban explorers, sealed lower floors in Paris, with still decorated molding, half-submerged doors in Vienna, streets in Istanbul, where the original level crouched 6 feet beneath modern pathways. In Buenos Aires, one cafe owner took Amelia to his basement and proudly showed her a buried doorway still, painted with faded red lettering from a century earlier. The doorway stood tall enough for a person to walk through, but the bottom half was swallowed by earth. It used to open directly onto the street, he said, tapping it with his boot. Now look. When Amelia touched the cold wood, she felt an odd sensation, as if it had been sealed too quickly, too abruptly, leaving behind a kind of architectural shock. Many historians chalked these inconsistencies up to common explanations. Cities raised their street levels to combat flooding, improve sanitation, or modernize. And some did. But not like this. Not everywhere. Not all at once. Not in identical patterns across cultures with no connection. The anomalies weren't random. They were synchronized. And the deeper Amelia looked, the more impossible the coincidences became. In Prague, the lower floors of buildings still had signage, engraved stone plaques, advertising long gone apothecaries. Why would anyone engrave signs for basements? They wouldn't. Those floors were never intended to be basements at all. In Edinburgh, she found an entire row of shops beneath the shops people now used. Perfectly preserved, windows curved, framed, elegant, looked out into nothing but darkness and soil. In London, under the hum of modern traffic, she walked through narrow lanes where houses had bricked over ground-level doors whose thresholds now sat chest-high, compared to the street outside. The architecture was screaming a story people had forgotten, a story buried. One evening, deep in Berlin's old district, Amelia stood before a structure whose lower windows had been so meticulously carved with floral details that they resembled artwork. Whoever built them intended them to be admired at eye level. Yet, the city, now, required warning signs to prevent pedestrians from tripping into them. They were sunk so low that passers-by barely noticed them before stumbling. She crouched and ran her fingers along the stone. The curves were smooth, not the rough, utilitarian blocks used for basements. These were deliberate, decorative, and lovingly crafted. "What happened to you?" she whispered to the buried windows, imagining the artisans who carved them. Men who had expected their work to face the world, not the underside of a modern sidewalk. As she traveled, she realized something chilling. The anomalies didn't depend on geography, climate, or age. Brand new buildings stood atop buried older floors. Churches, shops, townhouses, factories, it didn't matter. Entire cities appeared to have risen by several feet, swallowing their own lower stories as though the earth had gently, silently climbed inside them. Or as if a layer of something had settled on top. Something thick, something heavy, something like mud. Her grandfather's old journals contained sketches uncannily similar to the structures she now photographed. Arches, windows, doorways, all buried In the margins, he had written notes in cramped handwriting. Not uplift. Infilling, mudline, consistent across hemispheres. Civilizations do not bury themselves. Look beneath the anomalies. Every time she read that last line, a chill traveled her spine. In Venice, she visited a historian who claimed his great-grandfather had been part of an excavation team. He told her how workers had dug into what they assumed was natural soil only to uncover an entire second street beneath the first. A full street pavement, shops, windows, lamps, all buried in thick sediment. When she asked him what the excavation team concluded, he shrugged. They were told not to conclude anything, he said softly. They were told to fill it back in. Her breath trembled. Why? He looked toward the canal, as if the water might be listening. Because some histories, he said, make people uncomfortable. Everywhere she went, Amelia saw the same. Clues repeating, looping through time and architecture like a coded message. Whatever buried these buildings had done so quickly enough. That whole doorways and rooms remained intact but deeply enough that reconstruction was impossible, without monumental effort. At a university in Montreal, she examined a set of blueprints from the late 1800s. The drawings revealed doorways and windows at one level, but the building standing on that spot today sat at a completely different elevation, higher by 4 feet. When she asked why, the archivist shrugged. The ground rose, one said. Or the building sank, said another. But Amelia knew sinking didn't create symmetrical burial lines. It didn't leave decorative windows filled with identical layers of compact soil. It didn't hide floors without damaging them. This was not sinking. This was covering. And then there were the symbols. Wherever the anomalies were strongest in, the deepest buried structures, the oldest windows, the most inexplicably submerged. Floors someone had carved a circle intersected by 3 lines. The first time she saw it, she dismissed it as graffiti. But the second, the third, the 20th time, she couldn't ignore it. Some symbols were so old they were barely visible. Others looked disturbingly recent, carved into stone that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. The style was consistent across continents, as if the same hand, the same idea, or the same warning had traveled the globe. One night in Seattle's underground city, beneath the glow of her flashlight, she found the symbol carved into a support beam that predated the Great Fire of 1889. The guide said no one had ever noticed it before. But Amelia noticed. And she noticed the mud dot, the same thick, layered mud she'd found in Boston. The same mud packed behind windows in Chicago. The same mud lining the submerged buildings in Prague. It all connected. All of it. The buried floors, the raised streets, the identical architectural anomalies. In cities separated by oceans, the repeating symbol, the impossible mud dot, and the silent way history had smoothed everything over, pretending none of it existed. On a cold March morning in Dublin, while tracing a half-buried stone archway beneath a modern office block, Amelia finally admitted what her mind had been resisting. But her instincts had known all along. This wasn't a local event. This wasn't a regional phenomenon. This was global. A global burial, a global resetting. One so thorough, so uniform, so inexplicably precise that only one term seemed fitting, though she hesitated even to think it. Reset. An ancient one that swallowed civilizations whole and left only architectural ghosts, windows staring into dirt, doors opening into earth, lower floors entombed in silence, as she stepped back from the archway, her breath catching in the cold air. She realized something else, something worse. The anomalies weren't just memories of the past. They were warnings, because whatever had buried the old world had not left quietly. It had left patterns. It had left symbols. It had left signs. And deep beneath her feet, under the earth, under the mud, under the forgotten Florsay world below, was not as still as she once believed. Something had happened. Something enormous. Something deliberate. And the architecture remembered. The uniform burial. The more Amelia crossed, investigated the buried lower floors of the world's great cities, the more she realized she was standing at the edge of something vast, something that no academic discipline had ever successfully explained. What began as a regional anomaly had now revealed itself as a silent, global mystery. And nothing about it made sense. Whether she stood in front of a townhouse in London, a medieval block in Paris, or a neoclassical structure in Moscow, the same strange pattern repeated. Historical buildings were buried to almost identical depths, as if some unseen hand had pressed the entire world into mud at the same moment in time. In London, for example, she walked through the city district, where shiny modern glass buildings towered over narrow lanes, carved centuries earlier. Many tourists thought the odd step-down entrances were quirky architectural holdovers from Victorian times. But Amelia knew better. Those entryways were not designed to sit below the street. The ornate masonry around them told the truth. These doors had once been level with the ground. Now they hovered less than 3 feet above the sidewalk. The original base swallowed by compacted soil. In Moscow, she found the same phenomenon. Historical archives proudly displayed blueprints of buildings constructed with grand entrances flush with the street. Yet today, those same entrances were half covered, forcing visitors to duck beneath stone arches that once stood tall and proud. Some buildings had added new doors higher up, artificial. The original entrances sealed behind layers of earth, untouched but unmistakably buried. Paris, too, showed the same signature. In the 4th arrondissement, she stood before a row of 18th century buildings whose original ground floor windows now sat below the modern pedestrian walkway. Locals had grown so accustomed to the odd proportions that they barely noticed the truth staring them in the face. The city had not risen gradually. Through centuries of rebuilding, it had been pushed upward, or rather, buried downward by an event that left behind a uniform layer of sediment. The consistency was shocking. No matter the location, no matter the climate, the measurements repeated with eerie accuracy. Between 2.5 and 4 feet of uniform burial. Variations were minimal. Deviations were rare. Something had blanketed the cities of the world with a strangely even layer of earth. But how? Natural geological processes did not behave this way. They left chaos, not symmetry. Flooding, for instance, created uneven layers, and erosion carved irregular shapes. Land subsidence occurred in pockets, not with perfect linearity. Volcanic ash created dramatic layers, but only near the eruption site. Nothing in nature blanketed cities across hemispheres in identical depths of mud. Yet that's exactly what Amelia saw. London, buried. Paris, buried. Moscow, buried. Buenos Aires, buried. Istanbul, buried. New York, buried. Melbourne, buried. It was global. Universal. Asynchronized phenomenon. One that no historian wanted to acknowledge. At first, Amelia assumed there had been some massive geological shift, something like a worldwide episode of rapid sediment deposition. But geologists had no record of such an event in the last few thousand years. Archaeologists refused to entertain theories that smelled even faintly of catastrophe. Historians dismissed the anomalies as local urban but the burial depth wasn't local. It was nearly identical everywhere. That realization stunned her more than any architectural discovery. She started documenting the depths, charting them on a world map pinned above her apartment desk, with red string connecting the pins. The pattern became unavoidable. A global event had pressed down on civilization with a uniform weight. Or perhaps it wasn't pressing down. Perhaps it was covering up. The more she collected data, the more she noticed that many of these buried floors still bore signs of being actively used shortly before they were swallowed. Wooden beams showed no scorch marks or decay. Tools lay scattered on earthen floors as if dropped suddenly. In one particular building in Buenos Aires, workers had unearthed a set of silverware neatly arranged on a table now, encased in hardened mud. People hadn't abandoned these floors. Gradually, they had been overtaken quickly, silently. In London, during a clandestine midnight exploration under Holborn Viaduct, Amelia discovered a narrow corridor that led beneath the modern street. The air tasted of dust and cold stone. Her flashlight traced the lines of a forgotten passageway, once bustling with life, but now devoured by sediment. At the far end of the corridor, she found it again, the circle carved into stone, intersected by 3 lines. Her breath froze. The symbol had followed her from city to city. It hid in places no one had touched for centuries. It marked walls buried long before the invention of electricity, long before industrialization, long before the world connected itself through trade routes and railways. It was the same symbol she had found in Boston, the same symbol she had seen in Seattle, the same symbol carved beneath the canals of Venice. Why was it everywhere? And why did it appear only on structures buried to the precise uniform depth of the anomaly? In Moscow, while studying a submerged entrance in an old merchant's house, Amelia found the symbol again, not carved this time, but painted with a pigment so old that it predated modern dyes, yet vivid enough to look freshly brushed. Her fingers trembled as she traced its outline in the air. She didn't dare touch it. The merchant's documents, preserved in the city archives, never mentioned the symbol. No record of any family crest, no religious significance, no political affiliation. Nothing. It was as though the symbol had been placed there by someone who had come after the burial, someone who knew exactly where to find the buried lower floors. But how could anyone have accessed these spaces after they were sealed under earth, unless they had been there during the event, or unless they caused it? That thought chilled Amelia more deeply than the icy Moscow winter dock. Could an ancient group, a forgotten civilization, or an unknown force have orchestrated something global, something that buried the world's cities in a uniform layer of mud, something powerful enough to push entire streets beneath fresh earth without destroying the buildings themselves? The floors weren't crushed, the walls weren't shattered, the structures remained intact. It was as if the earth had flowed around them like water, then solidified in place. A reset, a quiet reset, not of humanity's memory, but of its architecture, its physical footprint on the planet. A kind of erasure. Amelia recalled a letter she had found among her grandfather's belongings. It was the only piece of writing he had ever labeled "Do Not Share." Inside, in faded ink, he had written, "Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, but some are buried, not by time, but by intention." She hadn't understood the meaning back then. Now she felt the truth of it settling heavy on her chest. One night, overwhelmed by the enormity of her findings, Amelia laid out her notes, photographs, diagrams, and burial depth measurements on her apartment floor. She drew lines. She made charts. She stared for hours. The uniformity couldn't be coincidence. Too precise, too widespread, too deliberate. She needed answers, real ones, not academic, DEFLECTIONS. So she started digging through old newspaper archives, hoping to find mention of a flood, a storm, an earthquake, anything that might explain widespread mud deposition. But nothing matched globally. Events were local, isolated, unrelated. Except for one thing. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, there were scattered mentions of a great mudfall, reported independently in different regions. The descriptions varied, but one theme remained consistent: sudden suffocation of lower structures beneath thick earth. Some called it folklore. Others called it superstition. Her grandfather had called it the global reset. But Amelia no longer believed it was myth. She believed it was history buried beneath the layers of polite academic denial and neatly constructed narratives. A suppressed catastrophe. A forgotten truth. A uniform burial event that had swallowed the old world and left the new one, pretending it never happened. She leaned back from her notes, exhaling SHAKILY. There were still questions, chilling ones. Why was the depth so consistent? Why did the symbol always appear near the buried floors? Who carved it? What force could bury entire cities without destroying them? And why has the world forgotten? Amelia didn't know the answers yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no ordinary anomaly. This was a global mystery, one that someone, somewhere, had tried very hard to bury. And the more she uncovered, the more she felt it. Something beneath the earth was waiting for her to dig deeper. The conventional explanation. Urban fill. For as long as Julian had been investigating the buried architecture mystery, he had encountered one explanation more than any other, an explanation delivered with a certain academic confidence, a tone polished from decades of repetition. Urban fill. Professors said it. Museum guides said it. Textbooks summarized it with tidy diagrams, showing layers of earth gradually rising over time. Even the most uninterested passerby, when confronted with a half-buried door or a window sinking helplessly below street level, would shrug and offer that same phrase, as if it were a universal bandage for any historical oddity. But the more Julian traveled, the more he listened, the more the explanation began to feel like a chorus sung by people who had never actually heard the melody themselves. Still, if he wanted to understand the mystery fully, he needed to start here. The conventional belief that cities simply rose around their own architecture. According to this long-held narrative, early urban centers were chaotic, unplanned, and dependent on whatever materials were available. Streets were muddy, drainage was poor, and human waste, market refuse, broken pottery, and the debris of daily life accumulated slowly over generations. Fires swept through districts, leaving ash and rubble that later inhabitants built directly on top of. Floods left layers of silt. New roads were constructed over old roads to improve infrastructure. In some cases, like the famous raising of Chicago in the 1850s, engineers deliberately lifted entire blocks, inch by inch, to avoid stagnant water and chronic flooding. On paper, it seemed neat. It seemed plausible. But what troubled Julian was not the explanation itself, but the unquestioning certainty with which it was presented. Everyone knew this, but no one could point to a unified, complete record. Academic articles referenced older articles. University lectures cited outdated urban studies, and museum plaques summarized theories as if they were facts. The deeper Julian dug, the more layers of assumptions he found, layers not unlike the urban fill the theory described. He began his research in Chicago, naturally, since it was the crown jewel of the urban raising narrative. Engineers in the mid-19th century had indeed elevated buildings by placing thousands of synchronized jacks under their foundations. Contemporary newspapers described crowds gathering to watch entire hotels rise from the mud-like resurrected giants. But as Julian read through the archives, he noticed something odd. The Chicago project was always referenced as a definitive precedent, but it was also very unique. No other city had ever attempted something of that scale, not before and not after. And yet, the buried architecture patterns in London, Paris, Moscow, Istanbul, Boston, and Old San Juan were remarkably similar to each other. All showed sublevels sunk below current street height in ways that matched each other far more closely than they matched Chicago's engineer elevation. Was every city in the world simply a less documented version of Chicago? That seemed unlikely. So Julian expanded his search. In London, he walked through districts where Victorian walls seemed to emerge from the earth like half-forgotten skeletons. Locals insisted it was due to centuries of refuse, fires, and the rebuilding that followed the Great Fire of 1666. But as Julian explored the untouched foundations of long-abandoned inns and warehouses, he found layers of soil that did not match the composition of debris. They were compacted natural earth, sedimentary layers that looked as if they belonged in a river delta or floodplain, not in the heart of a modern European capital. In Paris, he visited neighborhoods built long before Haussmann's reconstruction projects. Streets had indeed been widened and elevated, but not to the degree that would bury basements by several meters. And more importantly, buildings that predated those urban reforms showed the same anomalies. Parisian historians had explanations for each individual case: silt, reconstruction, but no explanation for the consistency. In Moscow, he found entire rows of Zarathustra structures with first floors below ground level. Academics gestured vaguely towards soil buildup from centuries of occupation, but no one could show documents describing a deliberate raising of the entire city. No organized effort, no coordinated engineering plans, no single moment in time when Muscovites decided their streets were too low. It was all fragmented, yet the burial depths were eerily uniform. Julian returned home with notebooks full of contradictions, photographs of architectural oddities, and maps where patterns repeated like a hidden code. And as the evidence piled up, the urban fill theory felt less like an answer and more like a placeholder, an idea that people clung to simply because the alternative was uncomfortably large. But he needed clarity, certainty, something concrete. He arranged meetings with historians, archaeologists, geologists, and civil engineers, hoping someone would give him a perspective he was missing. But every conversation, the same. Polite smiles, shrugs, repeated phrases, arguments based on probability rather than documented fact. One historian told him, "Cities naturally accumulate layers. It's just what happens." But why does it happen the same way in places with completely different climates, cultures, and histories? Julian questioned. Another scholar added, "Look at any old citule. Find it?" "Yes," Julian replied. "But why do the depths match almost exactly? Why do the patterns repeat with mathematical consistency?" A silence always followed. Then the same response. "It's complicated." Complicated was not an answer. Complicated was an evasion. Julian pressed further. He asked whether natural sedimentation could create such symmetrical patterns across continents. The geologists shook their heads. He asked whether fires and rebuilding could bury buildings by several meters within relatively short spans of time. The archaeologists hesitated. He asked whether documentation existed for the widespread razing of streets in European capitals. The urban historians delivered vague references to incremental modifications and practical adaptation. At some point, Julian realized that the conventional explanation relied not on evidence, but on the comfort of familiarity. It had been repeated so long that no one questioned it anymore. But Julian questioned everything, and he had begun to notice an important detail, one that none of the experts mentioned. The architecture itself did not agree with the story. If a street level had risen over time, then the buried floors should show signs of adaptation, like bricked-up windows, reinforced walls, or structural rearrangements to accommodate new ground levels. But in many cities, the buried levels were pristine. Doorways opened into nothingness. Windows stared into soil that had never been disturbed by tools. Staircases descended into earth that looked untouched since the day it settled there. And most telling of all, the buried floors were often more ornate, more detailed, more advanced than the floors above them. This indicated something profoundly unsettling. The buried floors were not originally meant to be underground. They were meant to be the street level. So either the world had collectively forgotten an era of massive coordinated engineering on a global scale, or something else had happened. Something not yet fully explained. That possibility gnawed at Julian. It whispered in the corners of his research. It echoed in his dreams. And each time he jotted another note, mapped another anomaly, or compared another photograph, the whisper grew louder. Whatever had buried those buildings did not happen. Slowly, it did not happen city by city. It happened everywhere. And it happened all at once. But the conventional explanation protected people from that terrifying thought. It wrapped the world in a blanket of familiarity. Everything normal, everything expected, everything rational. And yet the evidence, buried beneath layers of assumption, told a different story. Julian knew he couldn't settle for not anymore. If the urban fill explanation was only a partial answer, or worse, a comfortable myth, then the real explanation was still waiting to be uncovered, hidden not just beneath the earth, but beneath centuries of intellectual complacency. And whatever that explanation was, it would force the world to confront a past far stranger than its history books dared to admit. The inconvenient questions of time. Julian had always believed that time, unlike people, did not lie. Time could be distorted, forgotten, misremembered, or rewritten, but the physical evidence it left behind was supposed to be unbiased. indifferent, a silent witness carved into stone and soil. And yet, the deeper he went into the sediment records beneath buried architecture, the more time itself began to resist explanation, as though it had its own secrets to keep. The conventional narrative insisted on slow, gradual accumulation century by century, inch by inch. Human waste, broken pottery, ash from fires, small layers of silt from seasonal floods, scattered debris from everyday life. But when Julian compared soil samples from London, Paris, and Vilnius to those from Boston, Quebec, and St. Petersburg, he noticed something that academics rarely mentioned. These were not messy, organic layers from daily living. They were clean, strangely clean, fine mud, pure clay, homogeneous dust layers that looked less like the random chaos of urban life and more like the aftermath of a single eventa massive, sudden inundation rather than generational buildup. It was the neatness of the layers that troubled him most. Nature rarely worked in perfect horizontal lines unless something abrupt had forced it to. Similar patterns had been observed in volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, river overflows, and sudden landslides events that deposited Earth rapidly, not over decades, but within hours or days. Yet these layers existed deep beneath cities, far from volcanoes, oceans, and major floodplains. Time, it seemed, had misbehaved, and it left behind questions that historians preferred not to answer. Julian first noticed the discrepancy during his research in Warsaw, where he gained permission to examine subsurface layers beneath a preserved merchant house, while the building itself dated to the early 1700s. The basement, which should have shown the typical clutter of centuries, contained a sharp, uniform layer of light gray clay. This clay abruptly separated the original 18th century foundation from the newly elevated semblable century street level, built directly above it. The official explanation: natural flooding from the Vistula River. But when Julian consulted hydrologists, they shook their heads. That type of clay, they explained, did not come from the river. It was far too fine, too uniform, too clean. It more closely resembled sediment, produced by sudden compression, something that distributed particles evenly across a wide territory. Compression by what, though? When he visited Boston's North End, the same pattern appeared. A pristine layer of fine silt sealing off older cobblestones from the newer ones. In Lisbon, he found layers unrelated to the city's famous earthquake, even though local guides insisted otherwise. In Amsterdam, beneath a canal-side house, he found 3 distinct layers of sediment each, one seemingly deposited in a single moment of time, not gradually. Julian began comparing notes, samples, and timeline. And then came the most disturbing revelation. Many of these abrupt layers corresponded across continents. Places separated by oceans seemed to have experienced the same sudden deposition, sometimes within the same decades, sometimes within the same years. But how could that be possible? The urban fill explanation grew weaker with every sample he analyzed, every timeline he reconstructed. If these layers were truly deposited slowly, they should have contained human, refused charcoal broken, ceramics animal, bones decomposed organic matter tool snails, construction waste, but instead, most layers were sterile. No artifacts, no gradual transitions, just mud, suffocating mud sitting atop perfectly usable first floors that had been abandoned as if in a moment of collective resignation. The deeper Julian dove, the more he felt as if time itself had been interrupted. Yet that was impossible, wasn't it? He began turning to geological literature, hoping for a rational explanation. Rapid sedimentation could occur via natural disasters, tsunamis, major flood events, glacial movements, or dust storms of incredible magnitude, but none of these lined up with the locations of the anomalies. Moscow, for instance, was far inland and had no history of catastrophic coastal flooding. Prague was surrounded by hills. Edinburgh's old town sat atop volcanic rock, and yet these cities showed the same abrupt layers, the same suffocating mud envelopes sealing away. Architectural periods like chapters forcefully closed Julian brought these concerns to an elderly geologist named Dr. Helena Kruger, who had spent her life analyzing soil stratigraphy across Eurasia. She listened patiently, her eyes narrowing with every detail he provided. When he finished, she stood silently for several seconds before walking to a file cabinet and retrieving a dusty, yellowing folder. "This," she said, placing it on the table, "is a report that universities hate discussing." Inside were photocopies of soil charts from Berlin, Prague, Budapest, and Copenhagen. Each chart showed the same abrupt sifts, sudden layers, inconsistent with the slow passage of time. These were dismissed, Dr. Kruger explained, because no one wanted to question the prevailing narrative, not when the alternative would imply something global, something catastrophic. Julian felt a chill. "And what do you think happened?" She hesitated. "I don't know," she said softly, "but the evidence suggests that whatever it was, it did not happen over centuries. It happened fast. Too fast to fit comfortably into our historical timeline." He pressed further. Could it have been a massive storm cycle? A global weather event? "Even the largest storms leave chaotic, uneven layers," she replied. "Nature is messy. Chaos does not produce perfect sheets of clay across entire regions. Something else did this, something we no longer understand." Julian left her office with a folder full of forbidden data and a growing sense that time had been fractured, distorted in a way that defied conventional reasoning. As the weeks passed, Julian became obsessed with the anomalies. He pored over library archives until closing hours. He requested access to restricted archaeological reports. He contacted museums, universities, and local historians who all repeated the same safe explanations. But none had answers for the cleanliness of the layers. None could explain why historical periods were sliced apart so suddenly, like pages in a book torn out and glued back in with a different binding. When Julian mapped the sediment anomalies on a global scale, he noticed something alarming. The patterns suggested not perfect, but close enough to imply that the Earth had undergone multiple episodes of rapid deposition, episodes that had neatly severed historical eras, episodes that had erased something rapid layers were not. The result of time piling up. Rapid layers were interruptions, and yet history textbooks contained no descriptions of world-altering events that could have caused such wide-scale sedimentation. No global storms, no continent-spanning floods, no atmospheric events powerful enough to lay down kilometers-wide clay blankets. Unless those events had been forgotten or erased. The more Julian studied, the clearer the picture became. These layers were historical barriers, DIVIDERS.cut-offs, not natural artifacts of time, but evidence of time being disrupted, reset, even before new civilizations built atop the old. And then he noticed the strangest pattern of all. The abrupt sediment layers almost always corresponded with unexplained architectural gaps, moments in history when styles suddenly changed, when technologies appeared or vanished, when populations shifted without clear cause, as if history had been interrupted not just physically, but culturally, as if something enormous had happened, and the world simply started again. Julian tried to resist the implications. He wanted a reasonable explanation, something grounded in geology, archaeology, or climate science. But the evidence was stubborn. It refused to behave. It refused to align with long-accepted timelines. Time itself refused to cooperate. By now, Julian felt a tightening in his chest every time he uncovered another sediment core. The question haunting him was no longer what happened, but why did no one talk about it? Why did academia dismiss the anomalies? Why were contradictory soil samples filtered out of research papers? Why were the clean layers labeled urban fill, flood remnants, or miscellaneous? And then he realized something chilling, because acknowledging them would require rewriting not just chapters of history, but the entire structure of human chronology. The past had not flowed in a straight line. It had been ripped apart, abruptly, violently, more than once. Julian closed his notebook slowly, knowing that the more he uncovered, the more dangerous his path would become, for history was not wrong by accident. History was wrong because someone needed it that way. The American undergrounds. Julian had seen photographs of the American undergrounds countless times, grainy tourist snapshots, half-lit museum brochures, archived municipal diagrams, but none of them prepared him for the moment he descended into the actual buried city beneath Portland. The air changed immediately. It felt heavier, staler, as though it had been trapped for over a century and resented being disturbed. His flashlight beams swept across brick walls, dusty beams, and shadowed corridors that once had bustled with life, now sealed beneath modern streets like the forgotten basement of a forgotten world. This, the guide whispered, used to be the ground floor. Julian didn't need convincing. Every architectural instinct screamed that the room he was standing in had once opened directly to sunlight, not to asphalt and concrete nearly 20 feet above his head. He could see outlines of door frames where streets once met thresholds. He saw deep window wells, once storefront showcases, now opening only to darkness. What struck him most wasn't the age of the place, but the intentionality of its burial. People had walked away from this floor. Then someone or something had sealed it off, and the world had continued above, pretending the older layer no longer existed. Portland's Shanghai tunnels, as tourists liked to imaginatively call them, were usually marketed as quirky remnants of the city's frontier. These underground passageways, supposedly used for smuggling sailors, storing goods, or avoiding floods. But as Julian walked deeper into the subterranean maze, he realized that these chambers were far too extensive, far too structured, far too complete to be explained away as improvised tunnels or storage basements. They were a city beneath a city, a buried city. The guide, a retired municipal worker named Hayes, with a gravelly voice, paused at a wooden column whose base sank straight into compacted soil that had no business being there. "You see that?" Hayes tapped the ground with his boot. "This used to be open air. You'd step out onto the street right here." Julian crouched, running his fingers over the hardened dirt. It was not the crumbly, loose sediment of slow accumulation. It was a dense, almost clay-like material, packed so tightly that the wood of the column had compressed into it. The same sterile, fine-grained material he had seen across Europe and Asia? Was there flooding? Julian asked casually. Portland did have a river nearby, after all, Hayes snorted. Not enough to do this. Not evenly like this. And not all at once. Julian felt a chill. All at once. That's what the old reports say. Hayes lowered his voice, as though confessing a crime. This wasn't a gradual fill. It was a dump. A backfill. A backfill. But I'll tell you something, stranger. He leaned closer. No one knows where the fill came from. Julian's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean, the city records show nothing. No transport logs. No large earth-moving projects. No documented reason to bury perfectly functional buildings. Julian raised his flashlight again, illuminating the walls, the beams, the ghost of a world frozen mid-breath. Shops that once displayed merchandise. Doors that once swung open to greet customers. Staircases that once led upward into sunlight, now leading only to packed earth-like stairways swallowed by time. He'd seen similar things in Seattle ground floors, entombed by a layer of mud, abandoned, then reworked as basements after the Great Seattle Fire. The official narrative claimed that the city had intentionally raised the streets to prevent future flooding. Engineers built retaining walls and filled the gaps to elevate the new surface, leaving the older city buried beneath dot. But the timelines never aligned perfectly, and the sediment layers beneath Seattle's old sidewalks looked shockingly similar to the sterile clay layers he'd seen in Krakow and Boston. Julian remembered standing under Seattle's Pioneer Square, walking along what tour guides called the old sidewalks, now lying 12 feet below the current ones. The guide there had joked, "In Seattle, we built a new city on top of the old one because the old one was too wet." But that explanation hadn't satisfied him then, and it didn't now. Because a city doesn't bury itself without a reason. People don't abandon ground floors overnight. And sediment doesn't deposit itself in clean, uniform layers unless something sudden, violent, and widespread forces it to. As Julian proceeded deeper into Portland's underground, Hayes gestured toward a bricked-up archway. "That led to another block," he said, "but it caved in years ago. The city sealed it for safety." Julian approached the blocked passage and brushed dust from the bricks. They were newer than the surrounding architecture clearly added long after the original structure. As he leaned closer, he noticed something unnerving. The faint imprint of a window frame buried mid-wall, halfway up the sealed passage, a window that would have been visible from the street if the street still existed at that level. Instead, the street lay buried above, while the window stared eternally into compacted earth. "Why would anyone bury this?" Julian murmured. Hayes shrugged. "Ask. Ask the city. Their records are missing a lot of details. Too many, if you ask me." Julian stood there, studying the bricked-up window, imagining the world that once existed here. Foot traffic, horse-drawn carts, children running, merchants shouting prices. This place had been alive, vibrant, functional, and then sealed, buried, forgotten, as if erased. As if something had happened that history preferred not to remember. Julian had come to Portland expecting to observe underground architecture, but he had not expected to feel as though he were trespassing on a grave. Every echo of his footsteps seemed to emphasize how wrong the silence was. Cities were noisy things by nature. Their undergrounds should have hummed with the distant rumble of traffic, the throb of machinery, the vibration of life above, but down here, there was only stillness. Thick, suffocating stillness. Seattle's underground is even bigger, Hayes said as they walked. A whole network. Some parts are still accessible. Others, well, the city doesn't like people poking around. Julian heard the implication. Why not? Hayes hesitated. Because they don't have answers. And because some things down there don't make sense. Julian had heard stories of oddly preserved rooms beneath Seattle saloon floors exactly as they were left. Chairs still upright. Bar counters still intact. Shelves still lined with dusty bottles, as though life had stopped mid-step. As though someone had frozen a moment and buried it. Tour guides never mentioned those places. Only city workers whispered about them. Hayes continued. Ever seen a building buried button to roof? Not leaning. Not collapsed. Just swallowed. Vertically, I've seen pictures, Julian replied. Well, I've seen the real thing. Hayes stopped abruptly, shining his flashlight across the corridor. This is one of them. Julian stepped forward, breath catching. Before him stood a building facade, entire building facade. Its windows now sat at knee level. Its doorway was a narrow slit, barely 2 feet tall, pressed against a wall of hardened dirt. The structure was intact, not damaged. It had not collapsed. It had simply been overtaken, consumed, buried, double quotes. This was a shop, Hayes said. Dry goods, according to old maps, family-owned, prosperous. What happened to the owners? Moved. Apparently, records say the building was condemned because of structural issues. But look at it. He tapped a column. Solid, straight. Nothing wrong with it, except that they buried the first floor. Julian felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This happened before the fire, didn't it? Hayes gave him a long, measured look. Some parts, yes. Some parts long before, which contradicted every known historical timeline. Julian's mind raced. If Portland and Seattle shared similar anomalies, clean sediment layers, buried buildings, sealed ground floors, then the phenomenon could not be explained by isolated city-raising projects. It pointed toward a larger event, one that reached across the continent. Had the American West experienced the same mysterious deposition event he had traced across Europe and Asia? A reset. A flood. A global shift? A global shift? Something that left no record except the silent layers sealing older worlds from the newer ones. Julian lifted his flashlight one last time, examining the buried dust motes drifted in the beam like ancient ghosts. He imagined what it must have been like the day the layer settled, whether slowly or instantly, and how the world above simply moved on, leaving this entire level entombed. He had the sinking realization that he was not standing in a museum. He was standing at ground zero of a forgotten catastrophe. And he knew with terrifying clarity that the American undergrounds were not isolated case studies. They were warnings, fragments of a pattern repeating across continents, silent testimonies of a moment in history when sediment rose like a tide, swallowing cities without destroying them, burying them gently, neatly, deliberately. Who buried them? Why were they hidden? And most disturbing of all, what else was buried that no one had found yet? Julian felt the weight of the underground pressing on him, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. He knew this was only the beginning. He hadn't yet seen the deepest tunnels. He hadn't yet asked the most dangerous questions. And history had not yet revealed what it was trying so desperately to hide. Evidence of a sudden stop. Items left behind. Julian had seen the silent undergrounds, studied the sterile sediment, traced the consistent burial depths across continents. But nothing had prepared him for the first time he witnessed what had been left behind. It was in Venice, beneath a crumbling palazzo, in the sestiere of excavators working to stabilize the building for a city restoration project, had peeled back layers of mud and clay to reveal what remained of the original ground floor. Julian stood on the edge of the trench, his heart pounding as he looked down at the objects emerging from centuries of burial. A dining table, still laid as if awaiting a meal. Chairs, upright and spaced naturally around it. Silverware arranged beside delicate ceramic plates, all coated in a thin layer of sediment. Pots and jars, tools for daily life, children's toy stainy, wooden figurines painted with patterns that were still faintly visible, and near a back wall, a spinning wheel, upright and ready for use, as if its owner had simply stepped out for a moment. Julian knelt, brushing sediment gently with his gloved hands. The items had not been disturbed by time or human interference. They were preserved in their exact positions, encased by the mud as though the world had pressed pause and forgotten to resume. The guides called it mummified domestic life. Julian called it terrifying, because these items told a story no gradual accumulation or slow urban fill theory could explain. This was not a space abandoned over decades. This was a space stopped. It had been left behind in the midst of life, instantly frozen. And it was not unique. In Paris, archaeologists excavating a 17th century merchant's home uncovered a similar tableau. A ledger, filled with ink entries, remained open on a desk. A quill lay across it. Cups and cutlery stood upright on the dining table. Even a partially stitched garment on a loom lay frozen mid-stitch. The layers of fine mud above these items were clean, uniform, and sudden, just as Julian had observed elsewhere. They had not accumulated slowly. They had arrived quickly, enveloping everything in an unbroken, sterile layer that preserved not only the architecture, but the minutiae of everyday life. In Boston, he observed a cellar beneath an 18th century townhouse where a broom lay leaning against a wall, a few letters still on the counter, the signature of its owner visible in ink on one of them. Evidence suggested that the inhabitants had not planned to leave permanently. They had left in haste, interrupted, and never returned. Julian's mind replayed the sequence in terrifying clarity. Rooms once full of sound and motion, filled with tools, furniture, and human presence. And then, suddenly, quiet. A sudden stop. Life interrupted. He spoke to Dr. Marianne Choi, an expert in urban archaeology in Boston, about these preserved items. "It's astonishing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You see, people think urban layers tell a slow story. Trash piles up. Floors change over decades. Streets rise gradually. But what we see here, it's different. The objects, the arrangement they tell us. People left instantly, not slowly, not deliberately, just gone." Julian leaned in. But how? Why? And what caused the mud to arrive so uniformly? Dr. Choi shook her head. We don't know. That's the problem. Conventional explanations fail. Fires, floods, economic collapse, none of these would leave furniture upright. Quills on ledgers, spinning wheels in use, perfectly preserved mid-century. No one abandons a home like that. Not slowly, not carefully, not universally across continents. His thoughts raced. If the world's cities were buried in the same manner, if sediment had preserved entire floors instantly, then the evidence implied not just a sudden natural event but a synchronized global phenomenon. In Moscow, Julian examined a hidden floor beneath the Kremlin district that had been discovered accidentally during renovations. Workers had unearthed a set of tools, chisels, hammers, and saws left atop workbenches as though the carpenters had vanished mid. Even the sawdust on the floor remained undisturbed. He crouched to inspect the tools. They were coated in a thin, uniform layer of clay, matching the pattern seen across other continents. The deposition had been sudden, precise, overwhelming, and entirely global. You're seeing it. The head of the Moscow excavation whispered. The sudden stop. Julian nodded. He had a name for it now. The moment of interruption. Whatever had buried these buildings had done so abruptly, leaving people no time to remove belongings, no time to adapt, and certainly no time to anticipate the event. In Lisbon, during the excavation of a medieval townhouse near the river, Julian observed the aftermath of the 1755 earthquake and tsunami, layered beneath yet another sediment layer. Archaeologists had recovered perfectly preserved kitchen utensils, wooden cabinets still filled with wine bottles, and a chair propped against a wall in the middle of a small hallway. The city's official narrative described the tsunami's destruction, but the patterns of the preserved items didn't match. They weren't chaotic as one would expect from violent shaking and flooding. They were frozen, meticulously, eerily intact. Julian documented every example meticulously. He compared the shapes, materials, and positioning of objects across continents. Chairs upright, some with cushions still in place. Writing implements left, mid-use. Cooking utensils set on stoves or tables. Clothing partially folded or laid out on beds. Tools resting on benches as if the workers had simply stepped away. He noticed a pattern within the preservation. Wherever objects were left, sediment arrived in a thin, uniform layer, encasing the items without disturbing them. The mud was a perfect preserver, like the earth itself had acted as a protective hand. Julian began referring to these locations as time capsules, not just in a figurative sense, but literally, because they preserved a moment suspended in a layer of clay or silt that should have been erased by centuries. In Seattle, the underground tours included a basement of a 19th century saloon. The flooring had collapsed partially, but tables, chairs, and an upright piano remained in position. Dust coated everything, but no one had moved them. The patrons had vanished. The bartender's ledgers still had the ink of the previous day's transactions. Julian crouched beside the piano, tracing a finger along its polished wood. He could almost hear the notes, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. The entire scene, frozen under sediment, seemed almost playful in its cruelty. Life had been suspended, observed only by the quiet, unyielding earth. It's not just abandonment, Julian said aloud to himself. It's abrupt, sudden, deliberate in its timing. His research led him to question whether the phenomenon was localized to natural disasters. If sediment layers could preserve life mid-action across cities in North America, Europe, and Asia, the event must have been sudden, or at least universal in effect. He returned to Boston to consult more deeply with Dr. Choi and her team. They reviewed photographs from excavations in New Orleans, Seattle, Boston, and even Rome. The same patterns emerged: mid-use preservation, sudden sediment deposition, uniform layering. Think about it, Julian said during one late-night session, pointing to a map dotted with excavation sites. If people left all at once in some locations and the sediment covered their floors instantly, what does that suggest? Dr. Choi hesitated, as if she feared voicing the implications. It suggests an event of magnitude, yes, but the scale, global. That's the terrifying part. Julian leaned back, running his hands through his hair. He had suspected a reset before. Now, with tangible evidence, the items, the furniture, the tools, he felt the weight of it fully. This wasn't about buildings being buried slowly, like urban fill. This was about moments frozen in time. The abandoned items had a story to tell. They spoke not of neglect or decay, but of interruption. A sudden, overwhelming force had swept through cities, leaving behind life as it was, preserved beneath mud that hardened like cement. The evidence defied natural explanation and conventional timelines. And yet, despite the clarity of the evidence, the world above continued unaware. Streets and skyscrapers covered the time capsules, and only those willing or lucky enough to descend into the undergrounds could glimpse the truth. Julian's stomach tightened as he realized the implications. What had caused people to vanish mid-action? What had placed sediment over entire floors without disturbing a single item? And, most importantly, what else lay buried, preserved, waiting to be discovered beneath layers of earth across the globe? As he stepped back from the Venetian excavation, he caught his reflection in a dusty mirror propped against a wall. His eyes seemed older than they should have, as if the moment preserved him, too, the weight of history pressed down with the mud itself. He understood then that this was more than architecture, more than urban anomaly, more than sediment. These were snapshots of life stopped suddenly, evidence of events that conventional explanations could not touch. Julian realized the truth. The preserved items were not merely artifacts. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a sudden stop in human activity, a halt so complete that the earth itself acted as custodian, freezing 1,000 daily lives mid-motion, mid-thought, mid-breath. And the more he uncovered, the more he understood. This was just the beginning. A shift in focus. The universal memory of water. After weeks of documenting sediment layers, abandoned furniture, and perfectly preserved tools in cities spanning continents, Julian felt compelled to look beyond physical evidence. He had traced mud and clay deposits across Europe, North America, and Asia, charted sudden stops in human activity, and documented objects left mid. Yet, as compelling as the material record was, it offered no explanation for why these sudden interruptions had occurred. And it was this question, why, that pulled him toward mythology. Water, Julian realized, seemed to follow a strange pattern, not only in sediments, but in stories. Nearly every culture he examined, regardless of geography or era, spoke of civilization ending floods. These were not merely legends to scare children. They were recurring, structured narratives that suggested a shared memory, embedded in human consciousness. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, described Uttanapishtam and a flood that obliterated humanity. He remembered reading the passages. The skies darkened, the waters rose, the earth was consumed, and only a single family survived with the guidance of the gods. The city itself, the records implied, was swallowed beneath water, thousands of miles away in India. The story of Manu described the great flood and the fish who warned him to build a boat. Similarly, Noah's Ark in the Hebrew Bible told of a divine deluge that erased civilizations indiscriminately, preserving only the righteous and their vessels. Even cultures separated by oceans, millennia, and environmental conditions told remarkably similar stories. A rising tide, the destruction of cities, and the near erasure of human life. Julian began to chart these myths alongside the physical evidence he had collected. He found startling coincidences. The sudden layers of sediment, the frozen domestic items, the uniform burial depths, all aligned with approximate timelines described in these ancient stories. Could the myths be more than allegory? Could they be distorted memories of real events? He thought of the American undergrounds he had walked through, the preserved tables, the upright chairs, the quills frozen mid. Could these be echoes of a memory carried across generations? Stories encoded in cultural memory, later transcribed into legend, later forgotten, but somehow preserved. Julian traveled to Greece, tracing the flood myths in the works of Plato and local folklore. He examined archaeological sites near coastal towns, noting sediment layers that mirrored the patterns he had seen in distant continents. In some cases, ancient settlements appeared abruptly abandoned, the layers above them too uniform to be explained by slow accumulation. Then he moved to China, where the story of Yu the Great described a civilization interrupted by massive flooding, rivers overflowing, land submerged, and human life interrupted suddenly. It was a familiar refrain, like a distant echo of the same global narrative he had seen elsewhere. Julian realized he was staring at something extraordinary, an apparent global memory of water. It was as though every civilization had collectively remembered the same catastrophe of flood that wiped out life, then left survivors to start over. And the memory was encoded not in books, but in mythology, transmitted orally, passed through centuries, and adapted to local context while preserving the core truth. A sudden, overwhelming deluge. He consulted climatologists and oceanographers, seeking natural explanations. Could a mega tsunami, rising seas, or meteor-induced deluge explain the patterns of sediment and abandonment? Some possibilities existed, but none fully accounted for the global uniformity. The timing did not align perfectly. The layers of mud, clay, and silt appeared simultaneously in distant regions, separated by continents. Julian could not dismiss mythology as coincidence. The stories were too consistent, too detailed, too widespread. They all contained the same essential elements. A sudden, civilization-ending flood. Warnings to a select few. Preservation of life through vessels or elevated refuges. Complete destruction of existing settlements. A new beginning afterward. The parallels were uncanny, and they connected directly to the physical evidence he had uncovered. Sediment layers, buried floors, abandoned tools, all suggested the same abrupt interruption described in myth. He thought back to the Venetian palazzo, the dining table frozen in place, the spinning wheel ready for work. It was the pause of life, as though the flood had come without warning, engulfed the city, and left only fragments suspended beneath the earth. Julian began mapping the myths alongside the sediment layers he had recorded. Mesopotamia, Greece, India, China, Central America, North America. Northern Europe showed narratives of flood and destruction. Coinciding with these regions were the physical remnants. The undergrounds of Seattle and Portland, the buried floors of Boston, the mud-covered palazzos of Venice, the preserved furniture in Moscow, the clay-sealed rooms in Paris. He could almost see it, a pattern emerging from the chaos of centuries. Myth remembered the flood. Sediment preserved the aftermath. Modern architecture unknowingly sat atop the evidence. Julian realized that the flood had become both physical and cultural. Water had erased cities. Mud had preserved life. Stories had carried memory. The universal nature of the myths suggested more than chance. Perhaps early humans had witnessed a cataclysmic event, encoded it in oral tradition, and passed it down across generations, continents, and languages. The stories adapted, transformed, and diverged, but their core remained. Civilizations could be wiped out by water, and humanity must survive somehow. He found supporting clues in archaeology. Sites once thriving, now buried beneath layers of mud, showed no gradual abandonment. Tools were left mid-task. Meals remained uneaten. Cities ceased functioning overnight. Sediments arrived in a single, uniform layer. The parallels between myth and material evidence were growing impossible to ignore. Julian also noticed something even more profound. Myths often included refugees, survivors guided to safety, often instructed by divine or semi-divine figures. Could these accounts hint at a select group who witnessed the catastrophe firsthand? Could some civilizations have survived intentionally, while others were obliterated? In Mesoamerica, the stories of floods told of sacred ancestors building arks or ascending mountains, guided by gods or celestial instructions. In Norse mythology, Ymir's flood created the seas and reshaped the world, sparing only a few beings. Across cultures, the same thread emerged: a sudden flood, overwhelming in scale, leaving a select few to repopulate or reshape civilization. Julian began to hypothesize that this might explain the uniform burial depths as well. If a sudden global deluge deposited fine sediments everywhere, the water itself could have carried and leveled Earth evenly across cities, creating the exact patterns he had documented in Europe, North America, and Asia. It was not urban fill. It was a deluge with memory, leaving behind both the physical traces and the stories to remember it. He pored over ancient maps, floodplain records, and river deltas, finding small but telling details. Previously unremarked silt layers, clay deposits, and sudden changes in settlement patterns that aligned with mythical time. Humans had likely recorded what they remembered, an event so devastating that it became the foundation for stories across every ocean and continent. Julian walked along the waterfront in Venice at dusk, reflecting on the parallels between sediment and myth. Gondolas glided quietly, lapping against the sides of palazzos that had themselves survived centuries of water and neglect. He imagined the flood that could have carried mud into the buildings below, preserving the tools, furniture, and people's stories mid-action. It was a humbling thought. If the flood existed, it was no mere local event. It had to be vast, global. The same phenomenon that had buried floors in Portland and Boston could have reached Venice, Moscow, and the plains of Mesopotamia. And the story's mythology, folklore, epics were the echo of human memory striving to survive. encoded in narrative because physical evidence alone could not explain the trauma. Julian's notebook filled with maps, sketches, and connections. He drew lines between mythological narratives and physical evidence, color-coded by region. The result was striking. A web of interconnected memory and sediment, a literal overlay of human history and the memory of water. And yet, one question remained gnawing at the back of his mind. If the flood had been so massive, so transformative, why had humanity not recorded it more accurately? Why was the event encoded in allegory, metaphor, and legend instead of chronicles, libraries, or monuments? Perhaps, Julian considered, the answer lay not just in human memory, but in the nature of the event itself. If the deluge had destroyed records, cities, and infrastructure as efficiently as it had destroyed life, then only fragments would survive, physical traces beneath the earth, and oral stories carried in human consciousness. It was an unsettling idea, a global catastrophe, preserved in myth and mud. Julian stared at the sunset, over the canals of Venice, thinking of the countless cities he had visited. The pattern was undeniable. Water had a memory, humanity had a memory, and the earth itself had preserved both in sediment. The flood, he realized, was more than a story. It was evidence of universal memory that had shaped civilization itself. And somewhere beneath the streets, the tables, the chairs, the spinning wheels, the abandoned tools, and the buried floors, the truth waited cold and layered in clay, ready for anyone brave enough. The ancient reset narratives. Julian had long suspected that the sudden burial of cities and preserved artifacts might correlate with ancient myths. But it was only when he began comparing the myths themselves across cultures that a disturbing pattern emerged. These were not mere stories of local river floods or isolated natural disasters. They spoke of something far more profound, a complete reset of civilization, leaving only fragments for humanity to rebuild upon. He began with Samir, where the epic of Zusudra described a flood older than the biblical Noah. According to the text, the gods decreed the destruction of mankind, sparing only one righteous man and his family. Zusudra survived in a boat, guided by divine instructions, while the world around him was annihilated. When Julian read the lines aloud, he shivered. The flood was not a trickle or a localized overflow. It was global, catastrophic. Civilization-ending. From Mesopotamia, Julian traveled mentally across time and space. In Hopi mythology, he found similar narratives of water wiping away the previous worlds, purifying the earth before a new order could be established. The Hopi spoke of previous worlds that ended abruptly, with only a chosen few surviving to repopulate the land. In Mayan legends, he discovered accounts of civilizations swallowed by floods and disasters, where the survivors were forced to begin again, reconstructing human society from the remnants left behind. The details varied, but the core message was unmistakable. A cataclysm had erased entire civilizations, forcing humanity to reset. Even farther afield, in ancient India, the story of Manu and the fish mirrored the same pattern. Manu was warned by a divine fish to build a boat to survive an impending flood that would wipe out humankind. He heeded the warning, weathered the deluge, and repopulated the world afterward. Julia noticed that the fish was symbolic, yet the story reflected the same motif: sudden destruction, selective survival, and the rebirth of society. The striking element across all these narratives was the consistency. Despite geographic isolation, linguistic differences, and cultural the fundamental story remained the same. Civilization as it existed was destroyed. Only a few survived through foresight. Define Gedens or Shirlak. The world was reset and humanity had to start anew. Julian could not ignore the implications. If these myths were echoes of real events, they suggested that the sudden burial of cities, the preservation of everyday life beneath mud and clay, and the uniform sediment layers were not random occurrences. They were the physical record of a global catastrophe, encoded in story as humanity tried to comprehend its own survival. He began mapping the myths against the archaeological evidence he had collected. Locations like Venice, Portland, Boston, Moscow, and Lisbon all contained preserved items and sudden sediment layers. Each site corresponded roughly with regions where myths of civilizational resets had originated. The alignment was not perfect, but it was hauntingly suggestive. Julian took careful note of the details. In many of the myths, the floods did not merely destroy cities, they obliterated knowledge, architecture, and entire cultural systems. The survivors had to reconstruct civilization from scratch that aligned uncannily with the patterns of archaeological discontinuities he had noticed. Abrupt shifts in building styles, sudden gaps in technological development, and the enigmatic reappearance of complex tools or structures after periods of apparent absence. He looked at the Sumerians, the terraced pyramids of Mesoamerica, and the monumental architecture of the Hittites. In each case, he saw signs of interrupted development, then a resurgence of skill and complexity that seemed to emerge suddenly, as if knowledge had been preserved elsewhere or passed down orally during a generational gap. Julian began to understand that these myths might serve a dual purpose. They encoded memory of the catastrophic events themselves. They provided a blueprint for rebuilding society, ensuring that survivors would remember how to reconstruct civilization. Even the divine guidance, described in many myths, the fish, the gods, the mystical instructions made sense in this context. They were symbolic representations of survival knowledge, the preservation of essential skills, agricultural techniques, and societal norms. The mythic narratives ensured continuity despite the interruption caused by the floods Hay documented. The temporal and spatial distribution of these myths, and noted another pattern. The events described occurred during periods that roughly coincided with geological and archaeological evidence of sudden sedimentation and buried architecture. While ancient historians dismissed these accounts as allegorical, Julian saw them as a complementary record mythology, reinforcing the physical evidence. In Greece, he examined the stories of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived Zeus's flood and repopulated the earth. In China, Yu, the great's management of the waters after a catastrophic flood, represented a similar narrative: survival, reconstruction, and the reestablishment of civilization. The recurrence of these stories was astonishing. No one could deny the universality of the motif. Julian realized that these narratives provided context for the preserved items he had seen across continents: the dining tables, chairs, spinning wheels, and tools were not merely frozen in time. They were witnesses to the event described in myths. The flood had been so sudden and overwhelming that it stopped life in mid-ax, leaving the world in suspended animation until humans could rebuild above the sediment. He revisited the American undergrounds in his mind, the abandoned saloons of Seattle, the buried shops of Portland, the preserved floors of Boston. The suddenness of these events aligned perfectly with the myths. descriptions of instantaneous destruction and selective survival. There had been no slow abandonment, no gradual decay, only sudden, global disruption. The more Julien studied, the more convinced he became that the myths were not exaggerations, but encoded records of reality. Civilization had indeed experienced resets, and these stories preserved the memory of human survival strategies. The flood narratives explain both the suddenness of the sediment layers and the continuity of culture that emerged afterward. He also noticed the moral and instructive elements in many myths. Flood stories often emphasized righteousness, foresight, and obedience to divine guidance. Julien interpreted these as cultural mechanisms to ensure survival. Societies remembered the floods not merely to explain the past, but to instill behavioral norms for the future. Civilization itself depended on remembering the reset. One night, Julien pored over a collection of flood myths from around the globe. He organized them chronologically, geographically, and thematically. The similarities were staggering. Recurring motifs of water, destruction, survival, and rebirth appeared independently in every corner of the world. There were minor differences. The vessel might be a boat, a mountain, or a cave, but the essence was the same. He began to imagine the world as a series of layers. Much like the sediment he had studied, civilizations built, life interrupted, mud deposited, myths preserved. The earth itself became a library, storing both the physical and cultural memory of these events. Sediment was the archive. Mythology, the commentary. Julien realized that the ancient reset was not just an archaeological or mythological concept. It was a combined phenomenon. Physical evidence and human memory together told a story that no single discipline could fully capture. He began to formulate a hypothesis. The sudden sedimentation events, the preserved artifacts, and the flood myths were all manifestations of the same global catastrophe. It was a chilling revelation. Civilization had endured at least one catastrophic interruption, perhaps moraine-coated in layers of mud and clay, and immortalized in stories passed down through millennia. Humanity survived, rebuilt, and carried the memory forward in legend, but the truth remained hidden beneath streets, buildings, and sediment layers. Julien leaned back in his chair, staring at a wall covered in maps, timelines, and mythological accounts. The pattern was undeniable. Resets had occurred. Life had stopped. Sediment had preserved the world, and myths had encoded the lessons for survival. The evidence was overwhelming, compelling, and terrifying in its implications. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. There were more artifacts to uncover, more myths to analyze, more cities to explore. Each excavation, each sediment layer, each ancient narrative was a piece of the puzzle. Julien understood now that the ancient reset narratives were not simply stories. They were history written in a language the modern world had largely forgotten. The flood myths, the buried architecture, and the preserved items all converged to tell the same story. Civilization had been interrupted, humanity had survived, and the memory of water had endured across continents, oceans, and millennia. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of mud and sediment, the earth held countless more secrets, waiting for those brave or desperate enough to uncover them. The lost knowledge factor. Julien had spent months tracing the sudden burial of cities, the perfectly preserved artifacts, and the universal flood myths. He had uncovered a pattern that spanned continents and millennia. A sudden catastrophe, the preservation of life in mud, and stories of survival encoded in myth. Yet one thread had begun to emerge more vividly than all others, a disturbing and consistent element in every account: the erasure of knowledge and technology. In nearly every myth Julian studied, the flood or catastrophic event was not merely destructive, it was selective. Life itself often survived, but human achievement, the accumulated understanding of architecture, engineering, metallurgy, agriculture, and writing was obliterated. Civilization was forced to begin again, in essence, from scratch. He first noticed this in the Sumerian texts. The flood that spared Ziusudra did not preserve the city of Uruk or the ziggurats in their entirety. Entire systems of writing, architectural knowledge, and irrigation techniques were lost. Survivors had to reconstruct society from rudimentary tools, relying on memory rather than the full breadth of accumulated technological knowledge. In the Hopi narratives, the previous worlds had collapsed, and the survivors emerged into a mud-covered landscape. They had to relearn the basics: how to plant crops, how to build shelters, how to maintain community structure. The gods or spirits in these stories often guided them not just to survive the water, but to reclaim essential knowledge for rebuilding society. The message was clear: human technology could be wiped away, leaving civilization vulnerable. Julian reflected on the Mayan codices, which survived only in fragments after the repeated collapse of settlements. Archaeologists noted sudden technological regressions in construction methods and artistry following periods that corresponded roughly with flood legends. Techniques that once existed vanished, only to reappear centuries later, as if knowledge had been preserved orally or by chance, rather than continuously. The theme repeated across cultures. In China, after the great floods associated with Yu the Great, survivors had to rebuild from a fundamentally altered world. The myths emphasized the difficulty of recreating the lost infrastructure and governance systems. Similarly, in Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha began life anew, reshaping society from an almost primitive baseline. Despite inheriting memory of the past world, Julian began connecting this concept to the physical evidence he had collected. In Venice, Portland, and Boston, preserved artifacts offered tantalizing glimpses of daily life, but there were conspicuous gaps. Tools and utensils remained, but certain advanced devices, construction techniques, and engineering knowledge were absent or inexplicably simplified in subsequent layers. The abrupt disappearance of technology and knowledge aligned almost perfectly with the flood myths. Julian could now see that the preserved sediment layers were a double-edged record. They captured the last traces of civilization, mid-action, yet simultaneously buried the achievements that might have allowed continuity. Civilization was both frozen and reset in one fell swoop. In Moscow, Julian inspected a buried workshop beneath a 17th century street. The tools left behind were simple, yet some of the more advanced devices, a mechanical clock, missing entirely. The sediment layer indicated that the disappearance had been sudden, and the technology had not survived the inundation. When the city rebuilt above the layer, artisans worked with a reduced knowledge set. The reset was clear. Julian's research revealed a pattern. The survivors retained the basic knowledge required to live a shelter construction, basic metallurgy, but specialized skills, scientific understanding, and complex architecture often vanished. Myths consistently attributed these losses to the flood itself, portraying water not only as a destructive force, but as a purifier of civilization, washing away accumulated knowledge to start again. He began to consider the implications. Every sudden burial he had observed, every preserved artifact, and every myth about deluge pointed to a cyclical collapse of human knowledge. Civilizations could thrive, reach technological heights, and then be forcibly reset by events that were outside human comprehension. Julian remembered the Venetian palots where tables, chairs, and spinning wheels remained frozen realized that these items were remnants of what survived, but far more had been lost beneath the sediment. The materials for advanced tools, the blueprints of architectural feats, and entire cultural systems had vanished. In Mesoamerica, he saw evidence of a similar reset. The earliest Mayan cities, once sophisticated with astronomical knowledge and precise calendrical systems, showed interruptions in continuity after flood layers. Later, constructions often displayed simpler techniques, as if knowledge had been partially lost and reconstructed over generations. Even in North America, the American undergrounds held silent testimony. The preserved tools were functional, but primitive, compared to what might have existed before the sudden deposits of sediment, the floods, or the mysterious sudden events had not just buried buildings. They had buried the expertise, the accumulated wisdom, and the practical applications of human ingenuity. Julian began to compile a theory. These resets were both destructive and formative. They erased civilizations and simultaneously forced survivors to rethink, relearn, and adapt. Every flood myth encoded not only a warning, but also guidance for rebuilding. Divine instructions, mystical figures, and sacred vessels represented the necessary knowledge to preserve civilization from total collapse. He looked at the archaeological records from Lisbon and saw the same pattern. Sophisticated structures disappeared, replaced by more modest, pragmatic constructions in subsequent layers. The suddenness of the burial had obliterated much of the previous technological sophistication, ensuring a reset. The survivors had to start over. Julian began to notice subtle clues in mythological narratives that reinforced this. In many stories, gods or spirits guided survivors toward necessary skills: which crops to plant, how to construct shelter, how to navigate rivers safely. These dailies suggested that humanity's memory alone might not have sufficed. Survival and the eventual rebuilding of civilization depended on preserved instruction, encoded in oral tradition. In China, the Great's flood management story was emblematic. The flood destroyed not only towns, but irrigation systems, roads, and infrastructure. Survivors, instructed by learned how to rebuild from the ground up. Julian noticed that this mirrored the physical evidence. Sediment layers covered prior constructions, leaving survivors to reconstruct, often without detailed knowledge of prior technologies. The pattern was eerie in its consistency. Across continents, civilizations experienced sudden interruptions, lost accumulated knowledge, and had to rebuild using minimal surviving expertise. The myths, Julian concluded, were human attempts to encode the strategies necessary to recover from these resets. He also considered the psychological aspect. Humans who survived such events would have faced the dual challenge of grief for lost civilization and the practical necessity of survival. Myths may have served as mental scaffolding, preserving knowledge that could not survive in material form. Stories of divine guidance and sacred vessels were not just spiritually, were pragmatic survival manuals encoded in narrative form. Julian's investigations led him to a chilling realization. The physical evidence he had uncovered: the buried floors, preserved tools, and sudden sediment layers represented the last tangible traces of knowledge before each reset. These were the artifacts that survived catastrophe, but they were incomplete. Much had been irrevocably lost, leaving humanity vulnerable yet resilient. In Portland, the American undergrounds presented a microcosm of this phenomenon. The preserved shops and workshops showed tools, frozen, mid-use, but many of the more advanced devices that might have existed earlier were absent. Later, rebuilding reflected a simpler technological baseline. History repeated itself. Sudden destruction, partial preservation, and gradual rediscovery. Julian began to see this as a recurring cycle. Civilization develops knowledge and technology. A catastrophic event, often water-related, interrupts daily life. Sediment or other natural forces preserve a fragment of the world. Survivors emerge to rebuild, often starting from a primitive baseline. Myths encode the lessons for future generations. The realization was humbling and terrifying. Humanity had survived repeated resets. Technology, art, and culture had flourished and then been wiped clean, only to be reconstructed. Civilizations endured, but memory and knowledge were fragile, vulnerable to the whims of forces beyond comprehension. Julian returned to his maps, overlaying myths, archaeological evidence, and the physical layout of buried cities. A striking pattern emerged. The lost knowledge factor was not an anomaly. It was integral to the story of humanity itself. Each reset left traces: mud, sediment, frozen artifacts, mythic memory, but the cumulative effect was the periodic erasure of human achievement. As he stared at his maps, Julian felt the weight of time pressing down on him. The resets were not isolated incidents. They were likely part of a larger, recurring phenomenon. Humanity had survived because it could adapt, relearn, and encode vital knowledge in stories. Civilization persists, always in a fragile dance with forces capable of obliterating its achievements. Connecting the physical and mythological, Julian leaned back in his chair, staring at the labyrinth of maps, photographs, and mythological texts spread before him. For months, he had traced the sudden burial of cities, the perfectly preserved artifacts, and the recurring flood myths across the globe. The patterns were undeniable, but the implications were staggering. How could disparate disciplines, separated by centuries of study and thousands of miles, converge on a single story? And then it struck him. The answer was to connect the physical and the mythological. The mud-covered cities, frozen in time by sediment, were the tangible evidence. The universal flood myths, passed down orally and later codified in written form, were the memory. Together, they formed two facets of the same global catastrophe, single event that had both destroyed and preserved human civilization. He called it the mudflood hypothesis. In Venice, Julian had walked through layers of history frozen mid-use, tables laid for meals, spinning wheels poised for work, tools left where they had been held. In Seattle and Portland, he had observed 19th century underground floors, abandoned and buried beneath rising streets. In Moscow and Paris, he had documented sudden sediment layers that enclosed artifacts with uncanny preservation. Each site told the same story: sudden interruption, preservation, and burial. And across the world, he found stories, myths that mirrored the physical record: Ziusudra, Noah, Manu, Deucalion, and Pyrrha, the Great, Hopi, and Mayan flood narratives. Each described the obliteration of civilizations, the selective survival of a few, and the need to rebuild from a reduced knowledge base. Julian began mapping correlations. Every sudden sediment layer aligned approximately with the locations of flood myths. Every preserved object, every frozen table, chair, or tool was an echo of the story, a fragment of life abruptly halted. The myths were humanity's way of remembering what the mud could not reveal. The mud flood hypothesis proposed a radical idea. The world's buried architecture and the shared flood myths were not separate phenomena. They were complementary records of a single event, a civilizational reset on a global scale, preserved both physically and culturally. Julian imagined the moment itself. Vast deluges of water and mud sweeping through cities, abruptly burying streets, houses, and lives. People left behind their daily routines, unaware of the catastrophe until it was upon them. Tables remained set, tools remained in hand, and entire floors were encapsulated beneath a protective layer of sediment. Then the survivors emerged, often to a world where accumulated knowledge and advanced technologies had been lost. They had to rebuild from the remnants left behind, relying on memory, oral tradition, and divine guidance encoded in myth. Civilization persisted, but with a gap, a void in technological and cultural continuity. The theory unified observations that had puzzled historians and archaeologists for decades. Conventional explanations, gradual urban fill, slow sediment accumulation, or local flooding could not account for the global uniformity of sediment depths. The preservation of everyday objects, mid-use, that the simultaneous interruption of human activity across multiple continents, the recurrence of nearly identical flood myths in distant cultures. Julian considered the implications. If the mud flood hypothesis were correct, then every underground site, every layer of sediment, and every flood myth was part of a single narrative of global catastrophe. History, mythology, and archaeology were all pieces of the same puzzle. He began compiling evidence. In Boston, he documented cellars where 18th century floors had been buried beneath layers of mud, preserving letters, furniture, and tools. In Venice, palazzos revealed domestic life frozen mid-action. In Moscow, workshops contained tools left as if their owners had vanished instantly. Meanwhile, in myth, survivors navigated floods, built vessels, and preserved essential knowledge. Stories from Mesopotamia, Greece, China, Mesoamerica, and North America all conveyed the same principle: life survived, but civilization was temporarily reset. Julian realized the power of unifying these perspectives. Archaeology alone could describe the burial. Mythology alone could describe the human experience. Together, they explained not only the mechanics of the event, but also its impact on human memory and societal continuity. He began to notice subtle correlations in timing and geography. The sudden sediment layers appeared in cities with recorded myths about deluges and civilizational collapse. Even when the myths were separated by centuries or millennia, they described events consistent with the sediment record. In studying these connections, Julian hypothesized that the event had both physical and psychological effects. Physically, cities and artifacts were buried under mud, preserving them in perfect detail. Psychologically, survivors encoded the trauma in stories, ensuring that knowledge of the event and strategies for survival would persist across generations. The mud flood hypothesis offered explanations for previously unconnected phenomena. Preserved items, tables, chairs, tools, and utensils left medusa were physical evidence of sudden interruption. Uniform, sediment, layers, fine mud or clay enveloped entire streets, sealing history like time capsules. Lost knowledge, advanced technology, and complex societal skills disappeared, forcing survivors to rebuild from a more primitive baseline. Flood myths, oral traditions, preserved memory of the catastrophe, guiding future generations. Cultural continuity. Despite resets, core aspects of civilization, agriculture, tool use, social structure persisted due to mythic instruction. Julian traveled mentally across continents, envisioning the interconnectedness of these events. He pictured Mesopotamia, Greece, China, Mesoamerica, and North America as nodes in a global network, each affected by the same catastrophe. Each preserving fragments in sediment and story, he began to re-examine physical sites through this lens. In Venice, he realized that the palazzo floors preserved not only domestic life, but also traces of lost skills and technology, knowledge that would not survive in subsequent rebuilding. In Boston, the underground shops revealed similar patterns. The basics remained, but advanced tools were absent. Julian understood why myth had emerged as a global repository. The event had destroyed not just cities, but also the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. Myths encoded what survivors needed to know to continue human society. The stories were cautionary, instructive, and preservative all in one. The unification of myth and physical evidence was transformative. Archaeologists had long puzzled over buried cities and sudden sediment layers, often attributing them to localized floods, human negligence, or urban planning. Mythologists had dismissed similar flood stories as allegorical or symbolic. Julian realized that both disciplines were observing the same phenomenon from different angles. He began to map the chronology. Sediment layers corresponded to periods of disruption in urban development. Flood myths, passed down orally, aligned with these intervals. The patterns suggested multiple resets across history, each leaving traces in both the earth and human memory. Julian's mind raced with possibilities. If this theory were true, it could explain many historical mysteries. Sudden collapses of civilizations, re-emergence of technology after gaps, discontinuities in archaeological layers, recurring flood myths in unrelated cultures. The mudflood hypothesis, he realized, offered a unifying framework. It connected material evidence, preserved artifacts, frozen floors, sudden sedimentation, mythological memory, stories of floods, divine guidance, survival, and rebuilding. Lost knowledge. Civilizational resets forcing human ingenuity to start anew. Julian visualized the world as a layered archive. Physical layers captured tangible remnants of life. Myths preserved the intangible lessons. Together, they told a story of catastrophe, survival, and rebirth, a story that spanned the entire globe. He recalled the Venetian palazzo once more. Chairs upright, spinning wheels paused medusa, a dining table laid for a meal that would never be eaten. These were the last moments of life before a reset. And the myths across cultures were the human echo of that moment. Warnings, instructions, and memory, transmitted through generations. Julian realized that the hypothesis did more than explain events. It reframed history itself. The sudden burial of cities and objects, the preserved artifacts, and the flood myths were not random or coincidental. They were two sides of a single phenomenon, a global catastrophic event that physically and culturally reshaped human civilization. And as he stared at the maps, timelines, and photographs, Julian understood the deeper implication. This was a story of resilience as much as destruction. Life had stopped suddenly. Civilizations had been buried. Knowledge had been lost, but humanity survived. Sediment preserved fragments, and myth ensured continuity. Civilization endured, reborn time and again. Julian closed his notebook and let his gaze drift across the maps. The mudflood hypothesis was not merely a theory. It was a lens through which to view the past, connecting earth, memory, and human experience in a single, terrifying, and awe-inspiring narrative. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of mud and sediment, countless other artifacts, forgotten technologies, and lost stories waited silently for discovery, ready to tell the rest of the story.
The controversial timeline, post-antiquity event. Julian had spent years piecing together a narrative that spanned continents and millennia. Sudden sediment layers, preserved artifacts frozen mid-use, and myths recounting devastating floods. But as he dug deeper into the physical record, one element became increasingly puzzling and, to some, dangerously controversial. Certain buried structures, seemingly modern in architectural style or construction method, suggested that the catastrophic event might not belong exclusively to deep antiquity. It was a theory whispered about among a small group of radical researchers. The mudflood, or the civilization reset event, may have occurred far more recently than mainstream historians were willing to admit, perhaps even as late as the 18th or 19th century. Julian first encountered this claim while examining the underground shops of Portland and Seattle. Many of the buildings bore unmistakable features of 19th century design: brickwork with modern mortaring techniques, cast iron support beams, and early industrial era architectural flourishes. Yet, paradoxically, these floors were buried beneath sediment and layers of streets, as if the city had somehow risen above itself overnight. Conventional explanations attributed these discrepancies to urban infill or street-level modifications. Cities like Chicago had deliberately raised streets in the mid-1800s, creating sunken basements and layered streets. But Julian noticed anomalies that did not conform to historical records. Certain streets had risen far beyond recorded levels, and sediment layers were uniform and widespread, as though deposited suddenly rather than accumulated gradually. He began comparing the physical evidence with historical records. In some cases, building permits, tax documents, and urban planning logs were missing entirely or showed glaring inconsistencies. Structures appeared in official records only after they were already buried, leaving no trace of the construction process above ground. It was as if the sediment itself had overwritten the historical narrative. The implications were staggering. If the mudflood or the sudden catastrophic burial occurred as recently as the 18th or 19th century, it would upend much of modern historical understanding. Entirely documented eras, supposedly safe from ancient catastrophes, might have been interrupted, partially erased, or misrepresented in the surviving record. Julian recalled the preserved floors in Boston, where 19th century taverns and homes were buried under uniform sediment layers. Tables remained set for dinner, tools frozen mid-task. Local historians attributed the phenomenon to incremental street raises over decades, but Julian noted that the mud deposits were far too consistent and dense to have formed naturally over such a short time. In Venice, he examined palazzos that bore evidence of flooding or sediment deposition that could not be accounted for by historical canal overflows or medieval urban modifications. Floors that appeared to belong to relatively recent centuries were buried under several feet of compacted mud. And in Moscow, workshops from the 18th century exhibited the same sudden preservation patterns as far older sites. Julian began to wonder, could a civilization-altering event occur in what we consider the modern era, leaving behind artifacts and structures indistinguishable from everyday life? And if so, how could such a massive event escape the attention of contemporary chroniclers? He pored over old newspapers, journals, and letters from the 18th and 19th centuries. Occasionally, he found reports of unusual flooding, sudden street collapses, or inexplicable sediment deposits in major cities. Most were dismissed at the time as natural disasters, construction mishaps, or poor record-keeping. But Julian wondered whether these were fragments of a much larger phenomenon, fragments of a global catastrophe carefully overlooked or deliberately ignored. The timeline also offered a potential explanation for a peculiar consistency in myths and legends. While ancient stories described floods thousands of years ago, some oral traditions persisted into the modern era. These tales, transmitted across generations, might have been distorted and adapted, but still carried the memory of the most recent global disruption, one occurring close enough to the present to leave visible traces in relatively modern architecture. Julian's colleagues were skeptical, and some were openly dismissive. The idea of a post-antiquity mudflood challenged fundamental assumptions of modern history. To suggest that 18th or 19th century cities could be partially erased, buried, or reset was almost heretical in academic circles. Yet Julian could not ignore the evidence. The patterns in sediment depth, uniformity, and preservation did not discriminate by century. They affected both ancient and seemingly modern structures alike. He expanded his field research, visiting Lisbon, where the 1755 earthquake and subsequent tsunami had devastated the city. Julian noticed anomalies in street elevation and sediment layers that could not be fully explained by the earthquake alone. Certain structures that predated the disaster appeared to be buried in uniform mud, while others survived, echoing the selective survival described in flood myths. In Boston, he revisited the underground floors and observed the same phenomenon. 19th century buildings inexplicably buried beneath perfectly compacted mud layers. Archaeological studies and urban planning records failed to account for the uniformity or suddenness of the deposits. If the mud flood had struck during the 1800s, it would reconcile many of these inconsistencies, yet it also raised more questions than answers. How, Julian asked himself, could such a catastrophic event occur without leaving a clear historical record? Newspapers, municipal records, personal diaries. Surely someone would have noticed streets buried overnight, buildings suddenly submerged in mud, or entire neighborhoods disrupted. Perhaps the sheer scale of the event or its selective impact meant that only partial documentation survived. Perhaps memory itself was rewritten, consciously or unconsciously, to make sense of the inexplicable. Julian considered the possibility that the mud flood was both physical and psychological. It buried cities under mud, but it also buried history, leaving only fragments for future generations. Oral traditions and myths encoded the memory of the disaster, while physical evidence preserved life mid-action. Written records from the 18th and 19th centuries may have been lost, altered, or misinterpreted, leaving gaps in what we now consider modern history. The controversial timeline also offered a compelling explanation for anomalies in urban archaeology. Sudden, uniform sediment layers above relatively recent structures had puzzled researchers for decades. Traditional theories, poor drainage, deliberate street elevation, or construction errors could explain some cases, but not the global pattern Julian had documented. A post-antiquity mudflood accounted for both the physical preservation and the inconsistencies in historical documentation. He revisited flood myths with this lens. Perhaps some of the stories that had survived from ancient times were updated or conflated with memories of more recent catastrophic events. Myths were living narratives, adapted to fit the experiences of successive generations. If a global catastrophe occurred in the 18th or 19th century, it could have reinforced, reshaped, or renewed older flood traditions. Julian also considered the technological regression documented in post-flood layers. Even seemingly modern buildings, when buried, left survivors with only basic knowledge of construction and tools. Artisans and builders had to rebuild in a simplified fashion, often unaware of advanced techniques that had been obliterated. This observation aligned perfectly with the lost knowledge factor he had previously documented. Traveling to Portland, Julian explored more underground floors and warehouses. The sudden burial of 19th-century commercial buildings was striking. Tools and equipment of the period were preserved mid-use, while advanced devices and special...
The pattern repeated in Seattle, Boston, Venice, and Moscow. Structures from different centuries were buried in remarkably uniform mud layers. In some cases, urban planners' records did not match the observed street elevations or sediment deposits. Julian concluded that the event, whatever its nature, had acted rapidly, unpredictably, and globally, affecting both ancient and relatively modern civilizations. Some radical proponents of the post-antiquity hypothesis even suggested that certain recorded historical events, wars, earthquakes, or unexplained floods, might actually be partial remnants or local interpretations of the same global mud flood phenomenon. Julian was cautious about leaping to such conclusions, but the evidence was difficult to dismiss. The idea that the mud flood occurred as recently as the 18th or 19th century was revolutionary. It explained buried modern architecture, sediment uniformity, and inconsistencies in historical documentation. Yet it also challenged centuries of scholarly assumptions, forcing historians, archaeologists, and mythologists to reconsider timelines, causality, and the resilience of civilization in ways they had never imagined. Julian's hypothesis was simple in concept, but staggering in implication. A global civilization resetting event may have struck not just in ancient times, but as recently as the early modern era. It had buried cities, preserved life in mud, erased advanced knowledge, and encoded itself in myths, an event that straddled history, archaeology, and legend in a single bewildering moment. He knew he was standing at the precipice of controversy. Mainstream academia would resist the idea.
Skeptics would dismiss the evidence as misinterpreted urban development or anecdotal myth. But Julian could not ignore what he had seen. The physical and mythological record converged in a way that demanded acknowledgement. The post-antiquity mud-flood hypothesis not only explained buried modern structures, but also reframed the story of human resilience. Civilization had endured repeated resets, sometimes surprisingly close to our modern era. Knowledge was lost, societies rebuilt, and myths preserved memory, proof that humanity had survived catastrophes that history itself barely remembered. And yet, the question remained: if such a global event occurred in what we now consider recent history, what other traces might lie undiscovered beneath cities, streets, and sediment layers? How many modern structures had been buried without explanation? And how many myths might encode echoes of events that were closer to our own lifetimes than we dared imagine? Julian stared at his maps, photographs, and notebooks. The controversial timeline was no longer just a hypothesis. It was a possibility that demanded further investigation. Sediment, artifacts, and myths converged to suggest that civilization itself had been reset not just once in antiquity, but perhaps twice or multiple times, even into the early modern era. He closed his notebook and walked through the streets of Boston, imagining the hidden layers beneath his feet. 18th century taverns, workshops, and homes preserved in mud, silently recording a history the world had largely forgotten. If the post-antiquity mud-flood hypothesis was correct, the earth beneath modern cities was a time capsule of lost civilizations, waiting for those willing to unearth the truth. The geological riddle. Julian's post-antiquity mudflood hypothesis had gained him skeptical glances from historians, raised eyebrows from archaeologists, and cautious curiosity from geologists. While connecting buried cities with myths was one challenge, another loomed far larger, explaining how such a catastrophic event could physically occur. If cities across continents were suddenly buried under uniform layers of mud, what geological forces could have accomplished it so swiftly? He turned to the geological literature, poring over studies of lahars, hyperseismic events, glacial melts, and massive volcanic eruptions. Each phenomenon offered tantalizing clues, but none could explain the global uniformity and suddenness of the events with complete certainty. The more Julian investigated, the more the question of causation became a riddle, one that intertwined with the mysteries of history, archaeology, and myth. Volcanic eruptions were an obvious starting point. History records numerous eruptions that deposited layers of ash and mud over wide regions. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompeii, was a microcosm of what Julian imagined on a continental or global scale. Volcanic lahars, mud flows created when volcanic activity mixes with snow, ice, or rain, could sweep down valleys, engulfing entire settlements in minutes. The evidence in the archaeological record, sudden sediment deposition, preserved artifacts mid-use, fit the pattern. Yet there were limits. A single volcanic eruption, no matter how massive, could not account for simultaneous burial across distant continents. Vesuvius-style lahars, however destructive locally, could not explain a pattern that stretched from North America to Europe or from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. Julian realized that if a geological explanation existed, it would have to involve either multiple simultaneous events or a planetary-scale trigger capable of generating catastrophic mudflows worldwide. Hyperseismic events presented another possibility. Massive earthquakes, stronger than anything recorded in modern history, could destabilize riverbanks, hillsides, and urban centers. Landslides triggered by such quakes could deposit thick layers of mud and sediment over low-lying regions. Yet again, scale posed a problem. While localized mega-earthquakes could bury individual cities, they could not easily explain the uniformity of burial layers across multiple continents without invoking an almost inconceivable degree of synchronicity. Then there were rapidly melting ice sheets. Julian studied records from glaciology, periods when sudden warming could trigger catastrophic glacial melt, releasing enormous volumes of water and sediment. In theory, this could produce gigantic mudflows, or lahars, capable of engulfing cities at the mouths of rivers or low-lying regions. Evidence from North American glacial deposits hinted at sudden, massive sedimentation events, but correlating these precisely with buried 18th and 19th century structures presented a temporal mismatch. Ice sheets melting thousands of years earlier could not easily explain more recent anomalies. Julian began to synthesize the data. Perhaps the mudflood events were hybrid phenomena, a combination of multiple geological forces interacting in rare and extreme conditions. Massive volcanic eruptions could destabilize regional ecosystems, hyperseismic events could trigger landslides and mudflows, and melting ice or heavy rains could compound the deluge. The result, sudden, catastrophic burial settlements across multiple regions. Yet the riddle deepened when he considered the selective nature of destruction. Many buildings, streets, and neighborhoods were buried, while others, sometimes nearby, remained untouched. Tools, tables, and furniture were preserved mid-use, suggesting a rapid yet uneven flow of mud. This indicated that whatever geological forces had been at work, they had acted both quickly and selectively, shaping the sediment deposition with a precision that defied ordinary natural disasters. He delved into the concept of lahars, fast-moving volcanic mudflows composed of water, volcanic debris, and sediment. Modern lahars can travel at speeds exceeding 50 kilometers per hour, flattening buildings, sweeping away people, and depositing meters of sediment in the matter of minutes. Extrapolate this phenomenon to a global scale, he thought, and the patterns of sudden burial across continents began to make a terrifying kind of sense. But what could trigger simultaneous lahars in disparate regions? Julian explored theories proposed by radical geologists. Massive meteor impacts could shake the planet, triggering earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and the destabilization of ice sheets simultaneously. A meteor or comet striking the ocean or polar regions could produce tsunamis and mudflows capable of burying low-lying cities. Planetary-scale seismic resonance, unprecedented synchronization of tectonic plates, could in theory trigger widespread landslides and sediment displacement, though evidence for such an event was scant and controversial. Catastrophic climate events, sudden warming or cooling could trigger rapid ice sheet melts, torrential rains, and unprecedented flooding, dislodging sediment across rivers and valleys. Julian's mind raced as he imagined the world during such an event. Cities along riverbanks, Boston, Venice, Portland, would have been engulfed by torrents of water and mud. Hillsides would collapse, river valleys would fill with sediment, and coastal regions could be inundated by tsunamis. The result would be the sudden burial of life as it existed, leaving only fragments preserved for posterity. The uniformity of sediment remained one of the most perplexing aspects. In sites across continents, mud layers appeared evenly compacted, consistent in depth, and in some cases rich in clay and silt. Ordinary floods, even massive ones, typically leave uneven deposits. Julian suspected that if the mudflood was geological in origin, some unknown mechanism must have distributed sediment with unusual regularity, a phenomenon not yet explained by contemporary science. He began consulting experts in volcanology, seismology, and geomorphology. Some theorized that rare interactions between volcanic eruptions and glacial melts could produce lahars of extraordinary consistency. Others suggested that hyperseismic activity along continental fault lines could trigger synchronized landslides and debris flows. But all admitted that no known modern event came close to the scale implied by Julian's observations. He also considered smaller-scale analogs in history. The Pompeii eruption had preserved life in ash, while the eruption of Tambora in 1815 had caused widespread climatic disruption. Modern lahars have buried villages in minutes, preserving tools and household items. Could these smaller events, multiplied globally and combined with other natural disasters, explain the patterns Julian had observed? Perhaps, but evidence remained elusive. Julian's ruminations led him to a chilling realization. The mudflood may represent a class of geological events unknown to modern science. Catastrophic, rapid, and globally coordinated mudflows, capable of selectively preserving life and artifacts, were absent from contemporary geological models. The event was both plausible and puzzling, a riddle that merged the boundaries of archaeology, mythology, and geology. The implications extended further. If such an event had occurred recently, in the 18th or 19th century, it could explain why modern-style buildings appear buried under uniform sediment layers. It could also reconcile the rapid preservation of everyday items mid-use with the selective loss of advanced knowledge. Geological and mythological evidence converged once more, suggesting that this was no ordinary natural disaster. Julian began to visualize the world as a living, layered archive, shaped not only by human activity, but by forces beyond ordinary understanding. Volcanic eruptions, hyperseismic shifts, glacial melts, and possibly even meteor impacts could act in concert to produce the sudden mudflows that buried cities, preserved life, and encoded the memory of catastrophe in myths. Yet the greatest challenge remained unanswered: the actual mechanism. How could natural forces operate with such precision across continents, preserving some structures and items while obliterating others? What combination of geological phenomena could account for uniform sediment layers, preserved artifacts, and the selective loss of advanced knowledge? Julian did not yet have an answer. He knew only that the physical and mythological evidence demanded a serious rethinking of geological possibilities. Volcanoes, earthquakes, lahars, ice melts, and meteor impacts were pieces of a puzzle that had yet to be solved. The mud flood, as both a physical and cultural phenomenon, remained the greatest geological riddle of all. As Julian traced maps of buried structures, observed sediment layers in museums, and read through myth after myth, he felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on him. The earth itself seemed to hold secrets that no single discipline could fully decode. And perhaps, he mused, the truth would require a radical synthesis of archaeology, geology, history, and mythology, an approach that most of the scientific world was not yet ready to embrace. Yet, despite the uncertainty, the evidence was clear. Sudden, catastrophic mudflows had buried human life repeatedly, leaving behind fragments preserved mid-use, erased advanced knowledge, and inspired myths of civilization-ending floods. The mud flood was as much a geological mystery as it was a historical and cultural one, a riddle that spanned continents, centuries, and disciplines. Julian knew that solving this riddle would require patience, careful observation, and a willingness to challenge established assumptions. Every buried floor, every preserved tool, every sediment layer was a clue. Every myth of flood and survival was a piece of the geological puzzle. Together, they suggested that the mud flood was not merely a story of humans, but a story of the earth itself, in violent motion, shaping civilization in ways modern science had barely begun to understand. And as he prepared his notes for the next phase of investigation, Julian understood one thing with absolute clarity. The geological riddle was far from solved, and the mud flood still held countless secrets, hidden beneath layers of mud, sediment, and time. The invitation to doubt and wonder. Julian closed his thick notebooks and leaned back in his chair, staring at the maps, photographs, and layered diagrams he had compiled over months of obsessive research. The evidence of buried cities, sudden sediment layers, and preserved artifacts stretched across continents and centuries. The myths, legends, and oral traditions reinforced the physical record, speaking of floods, lost knowledge, and civilization-ending catastrophes. Yet, as he pondered the enormity of it all, a profound realization settled over him. The value was not solely in finding answers, it was in the questions themselves. The mud flood, the lost knowledge factor, the possible post-antiquity events, the global sediment layers, these were riddles. And in every riddle lay the invitation to doubt, to wonder, and to see history not as a series of closed events, but as a living, breathing puzzle. Every buried structure, every preserved object, every myth whispered not certainty, but possibility. Julian reflected on the underground floors of Portland in Seattle, where 19th century buildings lay buried beneath uniform mud. Tables remained set for meals, tools were frozen mid-use, and chairs stood as if awaiting the return of their owners. The suddenness of the burial defied conventional explanation, yet precisely because the answers were elusive, the mystery was infinitely richer. It compelled one to ask, how did this happen? Why did certain structures survive while others vanished? What was the true scale of the catastrophe? Even the myths themselves invited wonder. Stories from Mesopotamia, Greece, China, Mesoamerica, and North America described floods that reshaped civilization. Some spoke of divine guidance, others of epic voyages or sacred vessels. Taken literally, these accounts often seemed implausible, but taken symbolically, they offered insight into the human mind, its memory, and its method of grappling with overwhelming events. Myth was not merely fiction, it was humanity's way of recording incomprehensible truth. Julian considered the implications for the modern observer. We walk over buried streets, cross paths that conceal entire floors of history beneath our feet, and yet rarely give thought to what lies below. Urban development, construction, and pavement cover centuries of hidden narratives, leaving only fragments accessible to those willing to dig, physically or intellectually. And each fragment is a doorway to curiosity, a chance to ask questions that may never have definitive answers. The geologist's riddle, too, called for humility. Volcanic eruptions, hyperseismic events, melting ice sheets, lahars, and tsunamis could explain aspects of the mud flood, but none could account for it completely. Julian realized that nature itself retains secrets, that the earth has forces and rhythms beyond modern comprehension. Our understanding of history is inseparable from the limits of observation and inference. The invitation, then, is to accept uncertainty and engage with wonder. In museums, Julian gazed at the artifacts frozen in time, cups with faint fingerprints, books left open, weaving looms halted mid-thread. Every item posed questions. What were their owners thinking? How did they perceive the sudden inundation? Could they have anticipated the preservation, or were they victims of circumstance? Each object was a lesson in imagination, inviting the observer to bridge the gap between life and history, memory and myth. The mythological record mirrored the same invitation. Flood stories vary in detail, yet converge on the essential theme: a sudden catastrophe that disrupts civilization, a survival of a few, and the rebuilding of a new world. The divergence and convergence of these myths invite us to doubt the absolutes of recorded history and to wonder at the resilience and creativity of human memory. Julian thought about the post-antiquity hypothesis, the radical suggestion that a mudflood could have occurred in the 18th or 19th century. Whether true or not, the very possibility expanded the horizon of doubt. It compelled historians to reconsider timelines, archaeologists to re-examine sediment layers, and geologists to ponder unknown planetary-scale events. Here, doubt was not weakness, it was a doorway to discovery, to the broader exploration of the unexplained. Even the everyday streets of modern cities seemed different under this lens. Julian walked across cobblestones in Boston, imagining layers of history stacked beneath his feet. He thought of the families, artisans, merchants, and travelers whose lives were interrupted, frozen, or erased. Every footstep became a dialogue with the past, a question posed silently: what remains hidden beneath us, waiting to be discovered? Sleep, too, became a metaphor for this engagement with wonder. As humans drift toward slumber, our minds unconsciously sift through the day's experiences, memories, and questions. The mudflood, buried cities, and global myths operate similarly. They are the unconscious memory of civilization itself, pressing against the surface, inviting contemplation without demanding resolution. The answers may never be fully known, but the act of questioning enriches understanding. Julian imagined future generations peering at sediment layers and myths, reconstructing history as best they could. Perhaps they would uncover lost knowledge, interpret artifacts differently, or theorize new causes for the global catastrophes. Each era contributes a layer of interpretation, building upon the fragments left behind. History is not static, it is layered, sedimented, and alive, just like the streets above buried floors. He considered the psychological dimension of this invitation. Doubt, when embraced, fosters creativity. Wonder encourages exploration. The mudflood, with its physical and mythological evidence, exemplified both. Observers are drawn into its depths, asked to navigate uncertainty, and challenged to imagine possibilities beyond conventional wisdom. The mystery itself becomes a tool for intellectual expansion. Walking through the streets of Venice, Julian saw palazzos that had survived multiple centuries, their foundations layered with compacted mud. He thought about the people who built them, the layers of sediment that had preserved the floors, and the myths that may have arisen to encode similar events in distant lands. Each element was an invitation to ask, to explore, and to wonder, not merely to catalog facts, but to engage with the questions history presents. The concept of the mudflood and the broader pattern of civilization resets also underscores the fragility of human achievement. Advanced knowledge can be lost overnight, cities can be buried, and lives can be interrupted without warning. Yet, embedded within these catastrophes is a lesson in resilience. Humans rebuild, learn, and adapt, encoding the memory in artifacts and myths. The invitation to doubt and wonder lies in recognizing both vulnerability and tenacity. Julian thought about the cumulative nature of knowledge. Sediment layers, preserved objects, and myths are all fragments of a greater whole waiting to be interpreted. No single discipline, archaeology, history, geology, or mythology, can claim completeness. The invitation is to synthesize, to approach the unknown with curiosity, and to appreciate the beauty of unanswered questions. Even the physical artifacts themselves are ambiguous. A chair frozen mid-use or a table with a half-written ledger tells a story, yet leaves critical questions unresolved. Who used it? Why was it abandoned? What forces caused its sudden burial? These questions linger, compelling the observer to dwell in wonder and uncertainty. Julian's reflections turned inward. Perhaps the ultimate purpose of studying the mudflood is not to solve the mystery definitively, but to cultivate an attitude of inquiry, to recognize that history is layered, contingent, and often inaccessible in its entirety, to walk through a city and know that beneath each street lies a hidden narrative waiting to be imagined. In this light, myths of floods and cataclysms are not just cautionary tales, they are invitations to explore, question, and imagine. They encourage the human mind to grapple with scale, time, and the limits of understanding. They remind us that civilization is both fleeting and resilient, vulnerable to forces beyond our control, yet persistent through memory and adaptation. Julian looked at his maps one final time before closing his notebooks. The streets of Boston, Venice, Moscow, Portland, and Seattle were now more than geography. They were palimpsests of human experience, inviting questions about life. As he drifted towards sleep that night, Julian felt the weight of both the known and unknown pressing against him. The mudflood, with all its enigmas, had transformed his perception of history. It was not merely a series of events to be catalogued. It was an invitation to doubt, to ponder, and to embrace the mysterious forces that shape human life. History, Julian realized, is not a closed book. Some pages are buried beneath the streets we walk, hidden under layers of mud, sediment, and time. Others exist only in memory and myth. And in the spaces between, the true adventure lies. Not in certainty, but in asking the questions, letting doubt coexist with wonder, and exploring the world with curiosity unbounded by the need for final answers. The value of the mudflood, then, is not in solving it completely. It is in allowing oneself to wonder, to question, to peer beneath the streets, into the sediment, into the layers of myth, and imagine what lies beyond sight. To accept that history is alive, layered, and perpetually inviting inquiry. Julian whispered to himself, "Perhaps the greatest truth of all is this: the world below our feet is as alive with questions as it is with artifacts, and the act of wonder itself is a bridge to understanding, even when answers remain forever out of reach." Conclusion. History sleeps, but the mud waits. The streets were quiet as Julian walked slowly through Boston at twilight. The soft glow of gas lamps reflected off cobblestones, and the hum of distant traffic barely disturbed the air. He thought about everything he had uncovered: the buried floors of Portland and Seattle, the palazzos of Venice, the sediment layers in Moscow and Boston, the artifacts frozen mid-use, and the flood myths that echoed across continents. Each piece, each story, and each legend had led him to this realization: History sleeps, but the mud waits. Beneath his feet, in the layers of earth compacted by centuries of weight, the past was preserved. Mud, clay, and silt had swallowed homes, shops, and streets, leaving fragments of life for those curious enough to notice. Tables lay set, tools rested where hands had last gripped them, and letters, journals, and forgotten ledgers waited silently in the sediment. The ground held a record far richer than any library or archive. It was a silent witness to the rhythms of civilization, recording both the mundane and the monumental. Julian paused on a familiar corner, imagining the layers beneath the asphalt. He thought of the families who had lived and worked here, merchants, artisans, travelers, children playing in the streets, whose lives had been interrupted, encapsulated, and preserved by sudden geological forces. Each footstep above them was a gentle disturbance of history, a reminder that civilization is built upon the fragile remains of what came before. The mudflood, whether ancient or post-antiquity, was more than a catastrophic event. It was a testament to humanity's resilience. Cities had been buried, knowledge lost, and lives interrupted, yet people rebuilt. Streets were raised, buildings reconstructed, and communities adapted. Civilization endured. In that endurance lay the most profound story, the capacity of humanity to rise again and again on the foundations of a past that was partially hidden, partially remembered, and partially erased. Julian thought back to the global myths he had studied, the epic of Ziusudra, Noah, Deucalion, and Pyrrha, Yu the Great, and the stories of the Hopi and Mayan peoples, all recounted civilization-ending floods. They spoke of loss, survival, and the arduous task of rebuilding. The mudflood, in its physical and mythological forms, was a living expression of these same principles. The myths were memory encoded in story, while the mud was memory encoded in earth. Both spoke of civilizations interrupted and renewed. He pictured the palazzos of Venice, where 18th and 19th century floors lay buried under several feet of sediment. Chairs stood upright, dining tables remained set, and tools rested mid-use. Above ground, life had continued, as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, history lay waiting, compacted, patient, and inscrutable. Every layer of mud was a page in a silent book, offering hints to those willing to look, yet refusing to yield all its secrets. In Boston, the underground shops and cellars told the same story. The street above had risen, covering entire buildings, yet inside, fragments of daily life persisted. Newspapers, ink still legible, coins glinting as if freshly minted, machinery frozen mid-operation. These were time capsules of human activity, reminders that life continues even after abrupt interruption, and that memory, whether buried in mud or encoded in myth, can survive far longer than civilization itself. Julian reflected on the controversial timeline, the radical notion that a mudflood could have occurred as recently as the 18th or 19th century. It explained buried modern structures, uniform sediment layers, and anomalies in urban records. Yet the timing, while provocative, was less important than the pattern. Whether ancient or early modern, the mudflood had altered civilization, erased knowledge, and preserved life, leaving behind a world that was both familiar and mysterious. He walked toward the harbor, listening to the gentle lapping of waves. He imagined the forces that could have created such an event: volcanic eruptions, hyperseismic shifts, rapidly melting ice sheets. Perhaps multiple forces acted in concert, triggering catastrophic mud flows that reshaped landscapes and communities alike. The exact mechanism remained a riddle, a geological mystery intertwined with history and myth. But the message was clear. The earth itself had agency, capable of altering the course of human life in sudden, profound ways. The mud waits, Julian mused. Silent, patient, and indifferent, it holds the secrets of civilizations past. It has buried homes, workshops, streets, and knowledge, yet in doing so, it has preserved them for those curious enough to seek. The mud flood was not merely a story of destruction, it was a story of preservation, a chronicle of life frozen and memory encoded. It reminds us that history is layered, not linear, sedimented, not always visible, waiting, not lost. Above ground, humanity rebuilds. Cities rise again, streets are paved, and communities thrive atop buried layers of history. Each new building laid is a testament to resilience, a signal that while mud may temporarily interrupt, human creativity endures. Knowledge may be lost, advanced technology may vanish, but the capacity to rebuild, to adapt, and to continue remains constant. Civilization is a cycle of rise, interruption, and renewal. Julian considered the psychological dimension. Myths, oral traditions, and stories preserve memory where physical evidence is inaccessible. Flood legends encode lessons in survival, caution, and wisdom. They are humanity's response to the unknown and the catastrophic, guiding future generations through narrative where science and record-keeping cannot. The mud flood is both earth and story, sediment and myth, tangible and conceptual, concrete and symbolic. He paused on the edge of a newly paved street. Beneath the asphalt, the mud waited, compacted and silent. It held the weight of centuries, carrying traces of lives once lived, choices once made, and knowledge once known. It was a reminder that every city, every street, every building rests on foundations far older than the structures we see. Civilizations fall, ground levels rise, yet the echoes of the past endure. Julian smiled faintly. To sleep, he realized, was to trust that the day's mysteries would linger, unresolved yet waiting, ready to be explored tomorrow. The mud flood, buried cities, and myths of floods were invitations to curiosity, reflection, and wonder. History is not a closed book. It has pages beneath our feet, written in mud, preserved in artifacts, and whispered in stories. As night deepened, he imagined the world from above, continents dotted with buried cities, streets hiding entire floors of life, sediment compacted into silent testimony. Every artifact, every preserved item, every myth formed a mosaic of human resilience. The earth waits, patient, impartial, yet never forgetful. The mud does not judge, it does not speak, but it remembers. Julian thought of the countless forgotten lives, the artisans, merchants, farmers, and families who vanished beneath layers of mud. He thought of the children who once played in streets now buried, the meals left unfinished, the letters never delivered. And yet he understood that their stories persisted in sediment and myth alike. Memory is not fragile, it is sedimented, encoded, and enduring. Above, cities buzzed with life. Cars, trams, pedestrians, and streetlights moved oblivious to the layers beneath. The modern world rests atop the ruins of old civilizations, yet carries forward lessons encoded by time, sediment, and story. Each new brick laid, each street paved, is a testament to human resilience, a bridge between what was lost and what survives. Julian walked back to his apartment, the night wind brushing against his face. The mudflood, in all its mystery, had transformed his understanding of history. It was not merely a tale of catastrophe or an academic curiosity. It was a meditation on impermanence, continuity, and human ingenuity. The mud waits, silent and patient, but humanity continues, ever adapting, ever building. He paused one last time at the corner, imagining the layers beneath his feet, the palimpsest of life, sediment, and myth stretched across the globe, waiting for those who dared to question. History sleeps, yet the mud waits, a reminder of past catastrophes, preserved knowledge, and the endurance of human civilization. As Julian finally lay down to sleep, he felt a quiet awe. The streets above him were alive with modern activity, yet beneath the surface, centuries of civilization slumbered in mud, clay, and sediment. He realized that part of human experience is to walk above history without fully seeing it, yet to know it waits, silently chronicling the passage of time. And in that moment, Julian understood the ultimate lesson of the mudflood, that while civilizations may fall, while knowledge may vanish, and while ground levels may rise, humanity endures, rebuilding atop the ruins, guided by memory, myth, and resilience. Sleep well, he thought, and wonder. Beneath the streets, the mud waits.